My daughter-in-law kept telling me my son was recovering in Switzerland and that she needed to manage my money. But one morning, a delivery driver I knew showed up at my gate and said, "Sir, your daughter-in-law tried to have this package destroyed. Please look at it alone." I was suspicious, but I opened it anyway. What was inside made my heart stop. A cruel truth was fully revealed. Welcome to the story. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Now, if you were in my place, would you trust your daughter-in-law or the warning inside? That package comment below before we continue. This is a fictional story with dramatized elements for a more meaningful and engaging experience. My own mind had been failing long before the first real collapse in my life began. I sat on my porch swing, the familiar rhythmic creak of the rusted chains, sounding less like a comfort and more like a warning. Alaric Vance, a 69-year-old retired senior bridge inspector, had spent 4 decades identifying the precise moment steel surrendered to stress. Yet I couldn't seem to diagnose the rot in my own head. The Blue Ridge Mountains usually stood sharp against the North Carolina sky, but today the tree line blurred into a smear of charcoal and bruised plum. My knees felt like rusted hinges, locked and unyielding as I tried to shift my weight. A strange, sharp metallic taste coated my tongue, a copper tang that I initially blamed on the old pipes of the Vance homestead. But as the cognitive fog rolled in, I realized the flavor was internal. It was the distinct electric zing of adrenaline fighting something heavy in my bloodstream, a sedative I had no memory of taking. My hands trembled against the weathered wood of the armrest, and for a moment I feared the very foundations of my reality were being dismantled by an invisible crew. A bridge doesn't collapse all at once. It screams in the language of rivets and rust for years before the river takes it. I was hearing the screams now, deep in my marrow, but I was too paralyzed to find the structural failure. The air smelled of pine and rain-slicked wood, yet it felt thick like I was breathing through a wet wool blanket. I stared at the porch boards, trying to count the grains to keep my mind anchored, but the wood seemed to ripple like water. Every instinct honed from years of inspecting the iron guts of suspension bridges told me that my internal supports were currently under sustained attack. The vertigo was a physical weight pressing against my temples until the world narrowed down to the glint of the setting sun and that persistent haunting taste of metal. The silence of the mountains was broken by a sound that set my teeth on edge. Leonie Vance, my 36-year-old daughter-in-law, and a commercial property acquisition specialist with a smile as sharp as a closing contract, stepped onto the porch. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the boards, a rapid-fire staccato that sliced through my disorientation. She didn't look at the view. She looked at me with a practiced expression of manufactured grief. "Dad Silas is gone," she said, her voice dropping into a register of rehearsed tragedy. "He is in a Swiss clinic in Zurich, buried in an avalanche during his hiking trip. He is in a blackout medical state, and they won't even move him to surgery without a massive deposit." She thrust her phone toward my face, showing me a blurry photograph that my foggy brain couldn't process. It was a smudge of white and red, a chaotic image that could have been a mountain rescue or a spilled jar of paint. I squinted, trying to find my son's face in the pixels, but the screen was just a glowing rectangle of confusion. "I need you to look at these papers, Alaric," she insisted, her tone shifting from grief to a cold professional urgency. "For Silas. We have to move now, or the window closes." How much is a son's life worth in acreage? Leonie had the math ready before I even had the question. She fanned out a stack of legal waivers on the small wicker table, her eyes tracking my every blink. I felt a surge of primal fear, a protective instinct for my boy struggling against the chemical lethargy dragging me down. My mind tried to calculate the cost, the land, the legacy of the Vances, but the numbers slipped away like sand through a grate. Leonie's presence was a predatory heat, hovering over me as I struggled to breathe. She spoke of Swiss doctors and wire transfers, her words weaving a net around my senses. I looked at the papers, the text swimming before my eyes, the word transfer appearing and disappearing like a ghost in the fog. Every time I tried to ask a question, she intercepted it with a new detail of Silas's supposed suffering, her voice a relentless tide. I felt the weight of the pen she was trying to press into my hand, the plastic cold and alien against my skin. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate warning that I was being led into a collapse I couldn't see. The land was just dirt to her, but to me, it was the only thing holding the sky up. Yet if Silas was dying, what did the dirt matter? The conflict tore at the fraying edges of my consciousness, leaving me raw and exposed. Through the haze, another figure materialized. Kezia Platt, the 58-year-old long-term housekeeper, who had worked for the Vances for decades, emerged from the shadows of the house. She carried a tray with a fresh pot of tea, her movements as quiet as a shadow under a bridge. She set a second cup in front of me, her eyes lingering on my trembling hands, with a look that wasn't pity, but a cold clinical observation. "Drink your tea, mister." "Vance," she murmured, her voice flat and devoid of its usual warmth. "It will help the nerves." The cup felt unnaturally heavy as I lifted it, the ceramic radiating a heat that seemed to scald my palms. Leonie placed a document on the table, a medical bill for $200,000, the paper looking stark and official. The tea was cold. My blood was colder. I looked up and caught a glimpse of the window behind Leonie. In the reflection of the glass, I saw Kezia standing perfectly still. She wasn't watching me with concern. She was looking at a stopwatch in her hand, her thumb hovering over the button. A thin, sharp smile touched her lips, a look of satisfied timing that had nothing to do with brewing tea. Leonie's voice became a distant hum as the realization hit me with the force of a falling girder. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a demolition. Kezia wasn't just my housekeeper. She was the timekeeper for my execution. I didn't reach for the tea. I reached for the paper, my fingers tracing the cooling trail of a lie that had been printed less than an hour ago. The porch swing was still swaying from Leonie's departure, and the reflection of Kezia's clinical smile lingered in my mind like a stain. I forced myself upright, ignoring the weakness in my limbs, as a sharper clarity began to take hold. The fog was lifting, not completely, but enough for me to start seeing the pattern beneath it. I carried the Swiss medical report into my study, the air in the hallway smelling of dust and the faint sweet scent of the floor wax Kezia used to mask the rot she was sowing. I laid the document on my oak desk, right next to the brass-handled magnifying glass I had used for decades to find hairline fractures in structural steel. Steel doesn't lie, and neither does thermal ink. As I hovered the glass over the header, the truth leaped out in jagged, pixelated edges. Zurich doesn't use 8, 5 by 11-inch North American standard paper. They use A4. My eyes, though clouded by whatever chemical soup they were feeding me, caught the telltale sign of a hurried forgery. In the bottom right corner, partially obscured by a smudge of toner that smelled faintly of ozone, was a tiny microscopic watermark. It wasn't the seal of a Swiss clinic. It was a local store code for a Kinko's down in the valley, accompanied by a timestamp from 8:42 a.m. this very morning. The realization was a physical blow to my chest. Silas wasn't in an avalanche in the Alps. He was likely just a pawn in a game Leonie was playing with my inheritance. Lies have a scent. This one smelled like toner and desperation. I sat back, the leather of my chair creaking under my weight. My mind started to work the way it used to, scanning the blueprints of this betrayal for more points of failure. I flipped the page, my hand trembling less now, as the fury began to burn off the fog. That was when I saw the footer of the second page. It hadn't even been fully scrubbed. It was a recycled template from the Blue Ridge Hospice Center, a form usually reserved for end-of-life palliative care. They weren't just trying to steal the land. They were already drafting the paperwork for my funeral. The analytical coldness I had relied on during my years as an inspector took over, shielding me from the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I wasn't just a father being fleeced. I was a structure being prepared for a controlled demolition. The floorboards in the hallway groaned a specific light footfall I knew belonged to Kezia. I moved with a sudden fluid speed I didn't know I still possessed, sliding the report under a stack of old bridge blueprints just as the door handle turned. I retreated to the shadows of the corner, watching through the narrow crack of the door. Kezia entered the kitchen, believing she was alone. She didn't look like a grandmotherly housekeeper anymore. She looked like a technician. She pulled a small amber vial from a hidden pocket in the lining of her apron. With a steady hand, she measured exactly 3 drops into a fresh cup of herbal tea. She stirred it with a silver spoon, the clink of metal against ceramic, sounding like a death knell in the quiet house. She moved like she was pouring concrete, steady, irreversible. How many years of loyalty can be dissolved in 3 drops of clear liquid? I watched her face, searching for a flicker of guilt or hesitation, but there was only a mask of practiced neutrality. She was checking her watch again, ensuring the dosage was timed to the schedule Leonie had set. I retreated to the porch, collapsing back into the swing and letting my head loll to the side. I closed my eyes, feigning the stupor they expected of me. I heard her footsteps on the porch boards, the familiar rustle of her uniform. "It's a beautiful day for a nap, isn't it, mister?" "Vance?" she asked, her voice a soothing poison. I let out a soft, confused mumble, reaching out with a hand that I allowed to shake violently. I took the cup, the bitter herbal steam rising from the tea and stinging my nostrils. I waited until I heard the screen door hiss shut and the click of her retreating heels. I didn't hesitate. I leaned over the side of the swing and poured the steaming liquid into the large potted fern sitting in the corner. The soil hissed as it drank the brew. I watched as the vibrant green leaves began to curl and wilt, almost instantly the plant dying for my sins. But as the tea vanished into the dirt, I felt the last of the morning's dose begin to lose its grip. My mind was a bridge with a severed suspension cable, but the secondary supports were finally holding. I sat there for an hour watching the mountain tree line sharpen as the chemicals washed out of my system. The absolute certainty of my situation settled over me like a shroud. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't dying, at least not yet. I stood up, my balance returning, and walked back into the kitchen. I began to search not for more lies, but for the truth they had hidden. I knelt by the heavy oak kitchen table, running my fingers along the legs. One of them felt different. I twisted the base of the rear left leg, and it gave way, revealing a hollowed-out chamber. Inside, tucked away like a shameful secret, were my actual morning vitamins swapped out for the sedatives that had been turning my brain to mush. They had been gaslighting me with my own medicine cabinet. I clutched the real pills in my palm, the plastic casing biting into my skin. The poison was meant to make me forget, but all it did was make me remember exactly where I hid my backup set of keys. I stood before the bathroom mirror and practiced the death of my own dignity, relaxing my jaw until I looked as hollow and vacant as the shell they wanted me to be. The cold porcelain of the sink bit into my knuckles as I leaned forward, studying the slackness of my eyes. The pills I had recovered from the hollowed table leg sat heavy in my pocket, a secret weight that anchored me to the truth. I had to become the man they were manufacturing, a confused, decaying relic. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump and one corner of my mouth droop ever so slightly. It was a performance that required every ounce of my analytical focus. If I moved too fast or thought too clearly, the structural integrity of my facade would crumble. I spent several minutes staring at my own reflection until I no longer recognized the sharp inspector who had spent 40 years judging the safety of bridges. I was now just an old man waiting for the end. I debuted my performance that afternoon in the living room. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, likely from one of Leonie's business associates, and her own sharp, expensive perfume that always seemed to precede her like a chemical spill. She was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through documents on her tablet, while Kezia stood by the window, adjusting the drapes with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. I shuffled into the room, making sure my slippers dragged across the carpet with a rhythmic, irritating scuff. I stared at the television for a long moment, then turned to Leonie with a look of practiced helplessness. "Is it time for dinner yet, Martha?" I asked, my voice thin and wavering. "I can't find the news channel on this clicker." I saw them exchange a glance, a flicker of suppressed triumph passing between them, like a hand of winning cards. Leonie set her tablet down and walked over to me, her touch on my arm as cold as a mountain stream in winter. "It is Leonie, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a calculated, patronizing sweetness. "Martha has been gone a long time. Just rest now. Let me take that remote from you. How much of a man can you peel away before there is nothing left but the anger?" I allowed her to lead me back to my chair, nodding vacantly as she spoke. Inside, my mind was recording every detail, every micro-expression of their satisfaction. They weren't just watching me decline, they were cheering for it. Late that night, I waited until the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm of creaks and sighs. Using the skills of a man who knows every floorboard like a familiar blueprint, I navigated the dark hallways without a sound. I positioned myself near the kitchen pantry, my back pressed against the cool plaster. Through the half-open door, I could see the glow of a single low-wattage bulb. Leonie and Kezia were huddled together, their voices hushed, but carrying a jagged edge of urgency. They were discussing the liquidation schedule for the 85-acre estate, and the coldness in Leonie's tone as she detailed the dismantling of my life's work was a physical chill. "Once the old man signs the Northridge Tract, we won't need Silas as leverage anymore," Leonie whispered. She tapped a finger on a map. I recognized the ancestral forest my father had preserved for decades. The resort. My father's trees turned into a parking lot. It wasn't just a sale. It was an Alpine Ridge resort project, a high-density concrete scar on the land. I felt a surge of righteous fury, but I kept my breathing shallow. Then came the mention of a permanent solution for Silas. "Vance says the sedation can be made permanent whenever we give the word." Kezia added, her voice flat and clinical. The implication hit me with the force of a structural collapse. They weren't just holding Silas, they were preparing to dispose of him once the land titles were clear. My son was a leverage point with an expiration date. My rage was no longer just about the land. It was a primal paternal fire. Leonie's phone buzzed, and she stepped out of the kitchen to take the call, her sharp heels clicking away toward the foyer. Kezia turned her back to the pantry to begin tidying the counter, leaving the cabinet where she kept the amber vials momentarily unattended. I moved with predatory silence, a ghost in my own hallways, haunting the people who were trying to bury me. My hand shot out, snatching one of the amber sedative vials from the back of the shelf. I felt the smooth clinical glass against my palm, a piece of evidence that weighed more than its physical mass. I retreated to my bedroom just as I heard Kezia turn around. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I slipped into my room and closed the door, the latch clicking home with a finality that felt like a declaration of war. I went straight to my bookshelf, pulling down a hollowed-out copy of an old bridge engineering manual. I tucked the vial inside, hidden among the diagrams of tension and compression. But as I was closing the pantry door in my mind, I remembered a second vial I had seen briefly in the back of the shelf, one with a different colored label. I had managed to snag it as well in my haste. I pulled it out now, holding it up to the moonlight, filtering through the curtains. It wasn't a sedative. It was a concentrated dose of a potent allergen, something I have been deathly afraid of since I was a child. It wasn't meant to keep me quiet. It was meant for a sudden emergency, a way to end the project early if I became too difficult to manage. I held the vial of my own potential murder in my palm, and for the first time in my life, I understood why some bridges are designed to be burned. The roar of a diesel engine at my front gate didn't signal a visitor. It signaled a breach in the wall of lies Leonie had built around me. I stood on the porch, my hands resting lightly on the railing, projecting the same hollow-eyed vacancy I had practiced in the bathroom mirror. Inside, however, I was calculating the torquing of that engine and the distance to the property line. The sedative-induced heaviness still tugged at my limbs like lead weights, but the icy clarity of the night before remained. I watched the orange OT truck idle by the mailbox, its exhaust a thick gray plume that smelled of sulfur and old industry. I didn't wait for an invitation. I forced my boots to move across the gravel, the grit crunching under my weight with a sound like grinding teeth. Casper, a 45-year-old DOT driver with grease-stained knuckles and a nervous tick in his left eye, gripped the steering wheel of his truck as if it were the only thing keeping him from floating away. I had trained him years ago in the logistics of bridge maintenance, teaching him that a loose rivet was a silent confession of neglect. Today he looked like a man who had seen a bridge collapse and was waiting for the splash. He didn't turn off the engine. Instead, he reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a mangled brown paper package, its edges frayed and taped so many times it looked like a mummy. It was marked "Return to Sender" in thick red ink 3 times over. "Alaric, I shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the diesel. Leonie ordered it to be destroyed through official disposal at the depot. She said it was just junk mail from a scammer, but then she threatened my pension if I mentioned it again, accusing me of losing it in the first place when I asked for a signature. That's when I knew she was scared of it. I realized then that Casper hadn't just come out of a sense of duty. He was a cornered animal looking for an ally. "You did the right thing, Casper," I said, my voice steady and low. "The mail isn't her property. It's the law, and you've always been a man of the law." I took the package from him. It felt lighter than I expected, but the weight of what it represented made my arms ache. He didn't linger. He slammed the truck into gear and vanished down the mountain road, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and the silence of my own betrayal. In 40 years of checking rivets, I never saw a structure as rotten as my own family, did I? I didn't return to the house. I knew Kezia would be watching from the kitchen window, her stopwatch probably ready to time how long I spent at the gate. I retreated to the shadows of the detached garage, the air inside smelling of motor oil and dormant machinery. I sat on a stack of tires and examined the package with the clinical eye of an inspector. The smudged handwriting was unmistakably Silas's, loopy, hurried, and desperate. Leonie hadn't just rejected this, she had tried to erase it. I noticed a heavy ink thumbprint over the postmark, an intentional effort to obscure the origin. But as I tilted it toward the light, I saw the truth through the ink. The stamps weren't international. There was no Swiss franking, no Zurich markings. These were local domestic stamps. Silas was close. The package was light. The truth inside was heavy enough to sink a ship. I heard the screen door of the main house hiss open. Kezia was on the move. I couldn't risk her finding me here with the evidence. I slipped out the back of the garage and stayed low, moving toward the bulkheading of the basement entrance. The basement was a cold, damp sanctuary that the housekeeper avoided because the steep, uneven stairs were a hazard to her vanity. I descended into the darkness, the air cooling instantly. I moved past the old boilers and the crates of my late wife's belongings, reaching the workbench at the far end. I used a rusted utility knife to pry the cardboard open. Inside was a bed of shredded newspaper, and nestled within was an ancient scuffed Nokia brick phone, the kind that could survive a fall from a suspension cable. Taped to the back of the device was a square of rough institutional toilet paper. On it, in the same frantic handwriting, were 3 words that shattered the Zurich lie, forever not Zurich. Asylum. I felt a surge of protective fury that burned hotter than the mountain sun. He was being held in a madhouse, not a clinic, and Leonie was the one who had committed him. The basement was a tomb of old memories, but today it was the birthplace of a ghost. I reached deeper into the box and pulled out a small leather-bound logbook. I flipped it open, and my breath hitched. It was a handwritten log of every medication Leonie had ever purchased or brought into this house over the last 3 years. Silas had been tracking her, documenting the slow poisoning of our household long before they took him. He had known the bridge was failing before I even felt the vibration. "I'm coming for you, Silas," I whispered into the dark. "I'm coming." I checked the phone. It was dead, but I knew the old chargers were kept in the junk drawer of my basement desk. I plugged it in, watching for that first spark of life. The faint electronic chirp of the phone powering up sounded like a gunshot in the quiet basement. As the screen flickered to a ghostly blue, I realized I wasn't just holding a phone, I was holding a detonator. I tucked the device and the logbook into a hollowed-out section of the floorboards beneath my workbench, a spot I had used for emergency cash during the lean years of the department strikes. I smoothed the dust over the wood, my heart thrumming with a tactical clarity I haven't felt in a decade. I was no longer an old man in decline. I was a structural engineer looking at a faulty support, and I knew exactly where to strike to bring the whole thing down. The buttons of the old Nokia were stiff, resisting my touch, like the locked doors of the truths I was about to uncover. I sat on a stack of dusty crates in the far corner of the basement, the pale blue light of the screen illuminating the deep lines of my face and the silver stubble on my chin. Above me, the distant rhythmic thumping of the washing machine served as a heartbeat for a house that had become a tomb. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp earth and old blueprints, a familiar smell that usually brought me peace, but now felt like the interior of a bunker. I stared at the prompt on the screen. It was asking for a 4-digit code. My fingers, gnarled by years of field work and currently trembling with a cold metallic taste of fear, hovered over the keypad. 1982. I whispered the numbers as I pressed them. It was the year Silas was born, the year I became a father, and swore to protect a structure far more precious than any bridge in the state. The phone emitted a low electronic chirp, and the menu unlocked, revealing a primitive interface that seemed like a relic from a different lifetime. I navigated through the folders until I found a single saved voice memo. It was titled simply, "Dad." My thumb paralyzed over the play button. I have inspected failing bridges for 40 years, identifying the precise moment when tension becomes a catastrophe. But I wasn't sure I was ready for this particular structure to collapse. I took a steadying breath, the damp air cooling my lungs, and pressed play. The recording began with a harsh layer of static and a low, persistent hiss. Underneath the white noise, I heard heavy, ragged breathing and the distant rhythmic metallic clanging of a heavy security door. Then a voice emerged. It was a dry, unrecognizable rasp, a ghost of the vibrant sun I remembered. "Dad, if you get this..." "I'm at the sanctuary," the voice said, cracking on the last syllable. "Not Zurich, not Switzerland. She has the doctor, Dad, Emmerich Faulkner. They are killing me slowly." I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cold stone wall. The devastation was a physical weight, crushing the breath from my chest. Silas sounded hollowed out, as if the very essence of his being was being drained away by a pharmaceutical vampire. Silence in my son's voice wasn't calm, it was emptiness, the kind that only comes when something inside has been stripped away piece by piece. He explained how Leonie and this Faulkner had tricked him into a psychiatric hold, using fabricated IRS threats against my estate to make him sign the initial papers. "She said they were coming for you, Dad. She said the taxes. I did it to save you. I had to ensure you didn't lose the homestead." I felt a surge of cold fury so intense it made my teeth ache. Leonie hadn't just stolen 2 years of his life, she had used his love for me as the pry bar to break him. But the betrayal cut even deeper. Silas's voice grew more frantic, the rasp sharpening into a desperate urgency. It isn't just about the land, Dad. Leonie is using my architect's seal. She's signing off on the Alpine Ridge project using my name. She's specifying substandard dangerous building materials, cheaper steel, unrated concrete. She's building a death trap and my signature is the one on the blueprints. The structural engineer in me screamed. How can a woman kiss her husband goodbye and then sign the orders for his chemical lobotomy? The greed wasn't just financial, it was murderous. She was willing to let a resort collapse on hundreds of people just to pad her margins, all while keeping the one man who could stop her locked in a cage. Silas began to detail the specifics of his imprisonment, his mind still working with the tactical precision of a Vance. I am in room 304 of the Crestline Sanctuary, he whispered. The shift change is at 10 p.m. I overheard the orderlies. The service entrance code is 4822. Don't come for me through the front, Dad. They have the sheriff. They have everyone. You have to be a ghost. He described the schedule of the night sedation, the moments when the guards were distracted by their own routines. He was giving me the schematics for his own rescue, providing the load-bearing points of his prison. I listened with a grim, focused intensity, memorizing every digit, every timing. The basement was no longer a cellar. It was a war room. The recording was suddenly interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps on a hard floor. I heard a muffled shout and Silas's frantic whisper as he moved to hide the phone. I have to go. They're coming. Don't trust the T-Dad. Don't trust the audio cut into a sharp burst of static. But before it ended, a third voice drifted into the background. It was faint, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was the calm, measured tone of Kezia Platt directing someone to check the vitals. The revelation was a final jagged bolt through the heart of my remaining illusions. Kezia wasn't just a mole at home. She was an active participant in Silas's treatment, a bridge between my slow poisoning and my son's living hell. I snapped the phone shut, the plastic click sounding like the cocking of a hammer. I didn't feel old anymore. I didn't feel weak. I felt like a man who had finally identified the source of the rot and was ready to cut it out. I stood up, the dust motes dancing in the fading blue light of the screen like tiny silent witnesses. I moved to my workbench and picked up the scale model of the New River Gorge Bridge I had built years ago. I pulled the center span apart, revealing a hollowed-out section I had designed for storage, and tucked the Nokia inside. It was safe there, encased in the very thing I spent my life defending. Kezia wasn't just pouring my tea. She was helping them measure my son's coffin. I climbed the stairs, each step a deliberate, silent vow. I was going to find Silas, and I was going to make Leonie and her accomplices understand exactly what happens when you try to demolish a Vance. I didn't need a medical degree to know that the man walking up my driveway was a vulture in a lab coat. The low hum of an expensive German engine died out, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under polished leather shoes. I stood by the window of my study, my shadow long and thin against the bookshelves. Behind me, the house was silent, but it was the silence of a structure under too much tension. Dr. Emmerich Faulkner, the 52-year-old chief medical officer at the Crestline Sanctuary, adjusted his designer spectacles with a clinical detachment that hid a darker greed. He looked more like a hedge fund manager than a healer. Leonie walked beside him, her hand resting on his arm, with a subtle possessive nod that signaled their alliance. As they entered the room, the air suddenly carried the heavy, cloying scent of expensive sandalwood cologne. I forced my jaw to go slack, my eyes to drift toward the corner of the ceiling. Alaric, Dr. Faulkner is here to check on those memory slips you've been having, Leonie said, her voice a fragile porcelain mask of concern. I didn't look at her. My gaze was fixed on the doctor's wrists. There, glinting in the afternoon light, were a pair of gold cufflinks, intricate interlocking gears. I had given those to Silas on the day he passed his professional engineer exam. Seeing them on this man's sleeves, the spoils of my son's living death, sent a jolt of lightning through my nerves. It's just a routine screening, Mr. Vance Faulkner said, his voice as smooth and cold as a stainless steel scalpel. Tell me, do you know what year it is? I let out a soft, confused huff, letting my hand tremble against the arm of my chair. How much does a man's life weigh when it's balanced against 85 acres of prime timber? I pretended to search for the answer in the air. I think it's still August, I mumbled. Is Silas coming for lunch? He usually brings the good sandwiches from the deli. I saw Faulkner exchange a look with Leonie, a quick, sharp glint of satisfaction. He leaned forward, the cold touch of his stethoscope against my chest, feeling like the probe of an insect. He didn't care about my heart. He was measuring the depth of the chemical grave they had dug for me. He scribbled notes in a leather-bound folder with a fountain pen that scratched against the paper like a claw. I watched the ink flow, knowing those lines were the blueprints for my incarceration. I leaned into the role of the fool, struggling to remember my middle name, forgetting the month, even pretending to lose the thread of our conversation mid-sentence. The air in the room felt thin, pressurized by the massive weight of the lies being documented in real time. "He's showing clear signs of vascular dementia," Leonie Faulkner said, turning away from me as if I were a piece of furniture. "Advanced progression. He'll need specialized round-the-clock care." Leonie's posture changed instantly. The mask of the grieving daughter-in-law fell away, leaving only the sharp, jagged edges of the woman who wanted my land. The pen felt like a spear. Her eyes were the edge. She slapped a stack of papers onto my desk, the land transfer documents I had seen before. "Sign the damn papers, Alaric," she snapped, her voice losing its polished sheen. "You can't take care of yourself anymore. This pays for your stay at the sanctuary. It's for your own safety." I stared at the pen she held out. I feigned a massive spastic hand tremor, my fingers clattering against the desk. "I can't. The ink is too heavy," I whispered. "Martha says we shouldn't sell the North Ridge. The trees, they keep the wind away." Leonie exploded. The rage was a physical heat radiating off her in waves. She slammed her palms onto the desk, leaning in until I could smell the wine she'd had with lunch. "Friday," she hissed. "You have until Friday before the ambulance comes for you. If those papers aren't signed, I'm having you committed to the state ward. Do you have any idea what those places are like? Cold halls and forgotten men, Alaric? You'll be a number in a hallway, and I'll make sure nobody ever finds the room." She was no longer my daughter-in-law. She was the rising water under a bridge with no supports. I looked at the floor, letting a single fake tear roll down my cheek. Inside, my mind was racing through the load-bearing calculations of my escape. She thought she was threatening me with a deadline, but she was giving me a target. I noticed a document peeking out from Faulkner's folder, an intake form for a private wing at the sanctuary already signed by Leonie and prepaid. They weren't waiting for a diagnosis. They were just waiting for the check to clear. This wasn't a medical intervention. It was a kidnapping with a professional veneer. I watched her storm out of the study, the sharp, vibrating slam of the door echoing through the house like a gunshot. Faulkner followed her, his expensive cologne lingering in the room like a ghost. I sat in the sudden silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounding like a countdown. I wasn't just losing my mind in their records, I was losing my existence. If I didn't move now, I would be buried in that private wing before the week was out, a living corpse in a designer suit. I stood up, my tremors vanishing, my spine straightening with a snap. My eyes moved to the phone, hidden in the bridge model. I had 48 hours to find my money, find my son, and burn their world to the ground. I watched her car disappear down the drive, and as the dust settled, I knew the clock wasn't just ticking, it was counting down to my own disappearance. I moved through the tall grass at the edge of my own property, like a thief avoiding the gaze of the woman I had once welcomed into my family with open arms. The sound of my own heartbeat was loud and hollow in the silent study just moments ago, but out here under the canopy of the North Carolina pines, it was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I waited behind the mudroom door, listening to the rhythmic, aggressive drone of the vacuum cleaner in the main hallway. Kezia was occupied, her back turned to the rear exit as she scrubbed away the evidence of my existence. I slipped out into the morning air, the damp smell of moss and wet earth filling my lungs. I avoided the gravel driveway entirely, knowing that the crunch of stone would alert the very walls of the house. Instead, I opted for the soft, yielding moss of the forest line, keeping low and moving with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who spent 40 years inspecting the underpinnings of massive structures. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot to my heightened senses. The house felt like it was watching me, its windows like cold, glassy eyes tracking my escape. "Just keep moving, Alaric," I whispered to myself. One foot, then the other. I reached the hidden trailhead that led toward town, a path Silas and I had cleared years ago. I was no longer the frail old man Leonie saw in her records. I was a man on a mission to reclaim his life. I reached the outskirts of Highlands, an hour later, my boots caked in mud and my lungs burning from the unaccustomed exertion. I pulled my hat low, shielding my face from the neighbors who might recognize the retired inspector they thought was slipping into the fog of dementia. I walked into the Highlands First National Bank, the sterile over-air-conditioned chill of the lobby making me shiver. I bypassed the main line and approached a teller station in the back. Sarah, a woman I had known for a decade, looked up from her computer and froze. Her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and profound pity. "Mr. Vance," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think. We heard you weren't well. I need a full statement for the Vance Trust, Sarah," I said, my voice as steady as a load-bearing beam. I watched her hands tremble as she began to type. She didn't just allow the withdrawals, she leaned in and whispered that Leonie had presented a court order signed by Sheriff Vesta months ago. It made the systematic gutting of my life's work appear fully sanctioned by the law. A bank account is like a suspension bridge. You don't notice the corrosion until the whole thing is hanging by a single rusted wire. I stood there clutching the edge of the marble counter as the dot matrix printer in the back began its high-pitched, agonizing screech. It felt like the machine was screaming for me. Sarah handed me the paper, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "Mr. Vance." "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "The balance is $42.16. $42. The price of a life's work, the cost of a fool's trust." I stared at the numbers until they blurred. $12.5 million, the security for my son's future, and my own old age had been evaporated. Leonie hadn't just stolen my money, she had erased my legacy. I felt a cold shock settle in my bones, a weight far heavier than the leaden fatigue of the sedatives. I folded the statement with mechanical precision and tucked it into my breast pocket. I was a dead man on paper, but I was still breathing. As I turned to exit the bank, the noon sun glinted off the polished silver hood of a car turning into the parking lot. My blood turned to ice. It was Leonie's Mercedes. I ducked behind a thick brick pillar near the entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs with enough force to bruise. I watched through the glass as the car came to a stop in a reserved space. Leonie stepped out looking every bit the high-powered executive who had already spent my future in her head. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, her movements fluid and confident. "She's here." I thought, a spike of adrenaline cutting through the shock. How did she know? Did Kezia call her the moment the vacuum stopped? "Hide, you old fool. Don't let her see you breathe." I didn't wait to find out. I edged around the pillar, keeping the brick between me and her line of sight. I managed to slip into the narrow alleyway that ran alongside the bank, just as she reached the front doors. I pressed my back against the rough, abrasive texture of the alleyway bricks, the heat of the noon sun radiating off the stone. If she's here now, what has she done with the house while I've been gone? I peeked around the corner of a dumpster, watching her walk away from the car. That was when I saw it. Tucked discreetly onto the underside of her rear bumper was a small black plastic box with a blinking green LED, a GPS tracker. My analytical brain kicked into gear, processing the technical implications. Someone else was watching Leonie. Someone was tracking her every move with the same clinical precision I used to track a crack in a girder. Was it a friend, or an even more dangerous enemy I didn't stay to contemplate? I moved deeper into the shadows of the alley, navigating the discarded crates and the smell of stale grease. I was vulnerable, technically ruined and hunted, but for the first time in weeks I was armed with the truth. I pressed my back against the cold brick of the alleyway, clutching the bank statement like a weapon, and wondered if the person tracking Leonie was the key to my survival or the final rivet in my coffin. I wasn't just looking for an old friend in that park. I was looking for a ghost of the man I used to be before I became a target in my own home. The walk to Highlands Memorial Park felt longer than the miles indicated my body still fighting, the residual sluggishness of the sedatives I had finally stopped ingesting. I kept to the shadows of the oaks, my eyes scanning the perimeter, with the same clinical precision I once used to identify stress fractures in suspension cables. The cooing of pigeons echoed through the autumn air, a soft, mocking sound that underscored my own vulnerability. I found Merritt Rawlings, a 64-year-old private security guard and former Marine, sitting on a weathered bench near the duck pond. He sat in the shadows of his delivery van, checking the load on his tactical gear with the hands of a man who had seen too many bridges burn. Even from a distance, I could see the rigid set of his shoulders, a man whose internal compass was always pointed toward a potential threat. As I approached, I deliberately maintained the senile shuffle Leonie expected of me, my head tilted and my gaze wandering. I didn't get within 10 feet before Merritt looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're walking like your hips are made of glass." "Alaric," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that hadn't changed in 20 years. "But your eyes? They're still checking for structural cracks." I dropped the act immediately, my spine straightening with a snap that felt like a liberation. "Merritt, they've taken my son," I said, sitting beside him. "They've taken my name. I need the kind of help that doesn't wear a badge." I laid out the evidence, the amber vials, the hollowed-out table leg, the empty bank account. and the tracker I had seen on Leonie's Mercedes. Merritt didn't blink, but his jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ruggedized tablet, sliding it toward me. I was the one who placed that GPS tracker on Leonie's car 3 weeks ago, Alaric. Silas missed our monthly veterans breakfast. He doesn't miss those. Not ever. When I went to the house, Kezia told me he was in Switzerland. I knew she was lying before she finished the sentence. Trust is a weld. If it's done wrong, the whole bridge falls. Merritt's weld was still solid after 20 years. He didn't ask for proof. He knew the man who had mentored him for 2 decades wouldn't show up in a park playing games. We sat in silence for a moment as the first heavy drops of an autumn storm began to pelt the pavement. The smell of wet asphalt and rain-slicked earth rose around us, a cold reminder that time was a luxury I no longer possessed. Merritt stood up, gesturing toward his van. If we're going to pull this thread, we do it now. He drove me to the industrial district, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the glass. We pulled into the narrow, shadowed alley behind the Vance Acquisition corporate office. Merritt handed me a pair of heavy-duty nitrile gloves and a small, high-intensity headlamp. "We're gonna do a trash audit," he whispered. "People think the shredder is a grave. For me, it's just a puzzle with 1,000 pieces." We moved to the executive recycling bins, the smell of wet cardboard and rotting coffee grounds thick in the damp air. I began to sift through the bags, my fingers searching for the tactile difference of high-grade stationery or thermal labels. It was grueling, repetitive work, the cold rain seeping through my safety vest and chilling me to the bone. How much does a man's pride cost? In that alley, mine was worth exactly 1 aluminum can and a mouthful of lies. After an hour of digging, my fingers brushed against a sticky residue. I pulled out a crumpled, discarded shipping label for a restricted delivery from a local courier. Tucked inside, the same bag was a yellow handwritten post-it note, the ink slightly bled from the humidity, but still legible. It was a map to the corruption. "Look at this," I muttered, showing it to Merritt under the dim beam of the lamp. "Vance, consulting fee, $50,000. She's buying a doctor's signature." The note detailed the timeline for the final stages of the land grab, confirming the collusion between Leonie and the medical staff at the sanctuary. The intensity of my focus was broken by a flash of light. A private security patrol vehicle turned into the alley, its spotlight sweeping the brick walls like a searchlight at a prison camp. Merritt ducked behind the bulk of his van, with the fluid grace of a hunter, but I was caught in the open standing next to a half-overturned dumpster. I didn't have time to hide. I immediately slumped my shoulders, letting a string of drool escape my lip, and began rummaging through the trash for a lost aluminum can. I looked up as the light hit me, blinking like a confused animal. A young security guard with a uniform too big for his frame and a flashlight that cut through the rain stepped out of the car. "Move it along, Pops," he shouted, his voice full of the unearned arrogance of a man with a cheap badge. "This isn't a shelter." I let my hands shake, holding up a sticky soda can. Just looking for my nickel, sir. I lost my nickel in the bin. My wife, she needs her medicine." The guard let out a sound of pure disgust, the blinding glare of his spotlight making my eyes water. "Get out of here before I call the real cops and have you hauled to the tank," he spat. I nodded frantically, shuffling away with a practiced limp, the guard's sharp insult echoing off the damp brick. I waited until the taillights of the patrol car vanished before I returned to Merritt. I reached into my boot and pulled out the post-it note I had tucked away. My heart was still hammering against my ribs, but the cold calculation in my mind was absolute. October 20th. 10 days from now. 10 days to stop a murder. The note didn't just mention a bribe. It had a specific date labeled as total transfer/final sedation. I didn't need a medical degree to know what final meant in this context. The guard didn't see a father looking for his son. He saw a man at the end of his rope. He was half right. I pulled the fluorescent mesh over my shoulders, the reflective silver tape cracked with age, and realized that to save my son, I had to become the very thing I'd spent 40 years being, a man whose presence was too boring to be questioned. The smell of cedar and mothballs clung to the heavy polyester, a scent that usually evoked the quiet dignity of my office, but now served as a thin veil between me and a jail cell. I stood in the back of Merritt's van, the scratchy feel of the old safety vest, a grounding contrast to the adrenaline humming in my fingertips. I adjusted the faded Department of Transportation cap, pulling the brim low. When I caught my reflection in the van's side mirror, I didn't see a victim of a family conspiracy. I saw a man who belonged on a construction site, a civil servant with a clipboard and a grievance. Merritt handed me a calibrated laser level, and a heavy aluminum survey tripod. As I took them, he showed me the modifications he'd made in the hour before we left. The hollow center of the tripod wasn't empty. It contained a high-gain, long-range microphone and a pinhole camera wired into a small recording unit. I wasn't just walking in as a surveyor, I was a walking surveillance hub. Remember, Alaric Merritt said his voice low and steady. If you look like you're looking for a structural crack, they'll look for it with you. People see the vest and the tripod and they stop seeing the man. I gave him a curt nod, the weight of the equipment familiar and comforting. I'm not an old man today, Merritt. I'm the Department of Transportation. I stepped out of the van onto the dirt turnout near the Crestline Sanctuary, my boots hitting the earth with a purposeful thud. I moved with a slight stiffness, not the exaggerated shuffle of a senile patient, but the methodical pace of an inspector who has walked 10,000 miles of bridge decking. If the government spent 40 years teaching me how to find the rot in concrete, why did Leonie think I wouldn't find the rot in her? I reached the service gate of the facility, the white gravel crunching beneath my feet. A broad-shouldered sanctuary guard with a buzz cut and an aviator headset stood between me and the truth, his hand resting on a heavy-duty holster. He stepped out of the glass booth. His eyes narrowed as they swept over my worn vest and the tripod. I didn't wait for him to find a reason to stop me. I immediately began staring at the retaining wall beside the gate, shaking my head and making a sharp clicking sound of disapproval with my tongue. I adjusted the tripod with a metallic click as the legs extended, setting the level with aggressive precision. "You want the north wall to slide into the ravine," I snapped, looking at the guard for the first time. "Because that's where the data is pointing." The guard blinked, taken aback by the sudden offensive. "I don't have you on the manifest, sir," he said, though. His hand moved away from his belt to adjust his headset. I let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind I used on junior engineers who forgot their hard hats. "Of course I'm not on your manifest. I'm a field emergency dispatch from the DOT. We've got seismic anomalies showing up in the sensors half a mile down the ridge, and the primary suspect is the delivery bay foundation here. It's compromising the structural integrity of the main road." I shoved an expired federal-style inspector's badge in his face, keeping my thumb over the date while pointing at the official-looking seal. Technical jargon is a lockpick for the mind. I used it like a crowbar. I continued to overwhelm him with talk of subsidence, lateral load displacement, and shear stress, all while scribbling frantically on my clipboard. He looked at the tripod, then at my gray hair and the absolute bored authority in my expression. Lazy bureaucracy is a powerful ally. He assumed an old surveyor wasn't worth the paperwork or the risk of a facility collapse on his watch. "Call your director if you want to explain why the facility just slid 2 inches into the creek because you wanted a signature on a Monday," I added, already turning back to my tripod. The guard hesitated longer than I expected, his radio crackling in his ear, as if he was waiting for confirmation that never came. He looked from my badge to the tripod, weighing paperwork against potential liability. The silence stretched until I could hear the wind pushing against the fence. Then the buzzer sounded a harsh, high-pitched grinding noise that vibrated in my chest like a warning. The gate's locking mechanism disengaged with a heavy thud. "Make it quick, old-timer," the guard grumbled, stepping back into his booth. "My boss is a stickler for the rules." I gave him a distracted wave, my heart hammering a rhythm of triumph against my ribs. "The road won't wait for your boss, son." I walked through the gate, my boots hitting the pristine black asphalt of the interior perimeter. The air here was different, colder, sterile, and smelling faintly of bleach and cut grass. It was a manicured lie of a place. The buzzer was the sound of a bridge being crossed, and I had no intention of turning back. As I moved toward the delivery bay, I scanned the parking lot, my eyes landing on a blacked-out SUV sitting in a VIP spot near the main entrance. My breath hitched. Even from 50 yards away, I recognized the customized bull bar and the specific glint of a gold and silver shield on the dashboard. It was Sheriff Vesta's personal cruiser. My analytical mind processed the data. The sheriff wasn't just ignoring Leonie's calls. She was here, likely overseeing the final stages of the asset liquidation, or ensuring Silas didn't make a scene before his final sedation. I wasn't just up against a greedy daughter-in-law and a crooked doctor. I was walking into a fortress protected by the local law. I set my tripod down near the service entrance, pretending to take a measurement, while the pinhole camera captured the layout of the cameras and the guard rotations. I felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. They had turned a medical facility into a black site for their greed. I stepped onto the manicured grass of the clinic, and as the gate clicked shut behind me, I saw the sheriff's badge glinting in the window of the blacked-out SUV. I was a ghost in their machines now, but soon I would be the structural failure they never saw coming. The transition from the wild Blue Ridge air to the sterile, pressurized hum of the sanctuary was like stepping into a tomb designed by an interior decorator. I moved through the service entrance, my boots making no sound on the industrial-grade floor. Above me, the rhythmic sweep of a motorized security camera sounded like a ticking clock, its mechanical eye searching for anything that didn't belong. I pulled my clipboard tighter against my chest, a thin shield against the growing weight of the silence. I navigated the service corridors with a surveyor's eye for detail, pausing at a junction to study the fire escape maps posted near the elevators. My heart was a steady hammer in my chest as I identified the layout of the north wing. I noticed a flickering fluorescent bulb near a camera junction, its dying light creating a strobe effect on the wall. Watching the cameras, I saw they operated on a predictable 8-second sweep. 8 seconds, that was all the window I had. I timed my movements, slipping through the shadows as the camera turned its gaze away, feeling like a ghost in the very machine that was meant to keep me out. I recalled a file I had seen once, a background check Leonie had left in her home office. Kezia wasn't just a mole. She was a former licensed practical nurse whose license was revoked for medication theft years ago. Leonie hadn't found a loyal friend. She had found a criminal she could blackmail into being a professional jailer. A facility like this is built on a foundation of silence, but silence has its own frequency if you know how to listen for the cracks. I followed the hum of the pressurized ventilation system deeper into the heart of the north wing, my senses sharp and scanning for structural flaws in their security. As I approached the laundry staging area, a familiar scent hit me: lavender and industrial starch. It was the exact smell of the Vance homestead pantry, a scent that used to mean safety, but now carried the sharp tang of a crime scene. I pressed myself against a stack of heavy wooden crates, my breathing shallow and controlled. The service elevator dinged a sharp, cheerful sound that felt like a scream in the quiet hallway. I watched through a narrow gap in the crates as the doors slid open. A woman in a pale blue medical scrub set exited the lift, holding a clipboard with a terrifying authority. I knew that walk. I've watched that walk across my kitchen for 20 years. Lavender, the smell of home, now the scent of a crime scene. It was Kezia, but the domestic servant I had known was gone, replaced by a woman who looked like she belonged in a high-security ward. She moved with a clinical efficiency that made my blood run cold. She wasn't carrying tea. She was carrying the weight of a medical sentence. I watched her stop a young bored junior orderly named Mark with a name tag that hung crookedly from his cheap uniform, who stood nodding like a bobblehead at Kezia's commands. Level the sedation. Mark, she said, her voice the same calm, measured tone she used when asking if I wanted honey in my drink. Dr. Faulkner wants patient 304, compliant for the noon visitor. Yes, Nurse Platt, the boy replied, scurrying off toward the medicine cabinet. The revelation was a physical blow. Kezia turned the corner, her face fully visible in the harsh light. There was no warmth there, only the cold precision of a woman who had traded her soul for a paycheck. I lunged into a narrow linen alcove, my shoulder hitting the wall with a dull thud. I reached out and pulled a heavy cart of soiled sheets in front of me, the cold, rubbery texture of the vinyl bag slick against my fingers. I held my breath, the metallic taste of my own terror filling my mouth, as her footsteps stopped just inches from my hiding spot. I could hear the rhythmic squeak of her nurse's shoes on the linoleum, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the pounding of my blood. How many lives had Kezia snuffed out with that same calm, measured voice? She stood there for what felt like an eternity, likely checking a chart or adjusting her stethoscope. The air in the alcove was stale and hot, smelling of bleach and the sweat of forgotten patients. I stayed perfectly still, a rivet in a bridge that refused to snap under the pressure. Finally, the squeaking began again, fading as she moved toward the main nurse's station. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my hands shaking as I looked out from behind the cart. The noon visitor mentioned by Kezia wasn't Leonie, it was the shark lawyer. I knew that term from the Vance Trust documents. It was the nickname Silas used for the estate liquidator who specialized in forced sales. The final asset signing was happening today, much sooner than Friday. My deadline hadn't just moved, it had vanished. I was standing in the shadows of a facility that was prepped to erase my son's legacy in the next hour. Kezia wasn't just pouring my tea anymore. She was the gatekeeper to my son's final hour. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving a silence that screamed for action. I looked at the corridor leading to the patient rooms. Room 304 was somewhere in that maze of white walls and locked doors. I stepped out of the alcove, my old DOT cap pulled low, and began to move. Every second I wasted was a second Silas didn't have. I didn't have a map and I didn't have a key, but I had 40 years of experience finding the way into structures that were meant to remain closed. I was a Vance, and if this bridge was going to fall, I was going to be the one to choose how it landed. I emerged from the linen alcove with the predatory focus of an inspector who had finally found the crack that would bring the entire bridge down. The sound of Kezia's footsteps faded into the rhythmic hum of the pressurized ventilation system, leaving a silence that screamed for action. I didn't waste a heartbeat. I moved down the north wing corridor, my eyes locked on the room numbers, until I saw the heavy steel slab labeled 304. It wasn't a hospital door. It was a vault. Arrogance is their biggest structural flaw, and they had relied so heavily on the electronic keycard system that they'd neglected the emergency manual override. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thin tempered metal shim I'd swiped from my workbench. Using my mechanical intuition, I slid the tool into the gap above the handle, feeling for the secondary tumbler. After several tense seconds of feeling for the internal mechanism, I finally caught the secondary tumbler. With a sharp practice flick of my wrist, it clicked. I slipped inside with the silence of a shadow, pulling the door shut behind me. The room was dim, illuminated only by the sickly green glow of a heart monitor and the flickering of a dying fluorescent bulb in the ceiling. The air was a stagnant soup of industrial-strength sedatives, sour sweat, and neglected humanity. It was a stark, rotting contrast to the polished marble of the lobby. I saw the bed in the center of the room, and my breath hitched. Silas lay there, but he was a ghost of the man I knew. He was strapped down with thick leather restraints, the hide dark and worn from his futile struggles. I moved to the bedside, my hands trembling as I saw the IV line snaked into his arm. My analytical mind took over before the grief could drown me. I followed the tube back to the pump and felt a jolt of pure ice in my marrow. The IV wasn't just delivering a baseline sedative. It was rigged to a secondary remote-controlled servo pump. Emmerich could trigger a massive lethal cardiac event from his office with a single keystroke. They hadn't just imprisoned my son, they had wired him like a demolition charge. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about Silas's condition, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think I should unhook the IV now, or B, if I should wait and record the evidence first and give me one short reason for your choice. Please note, the following part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you can stop here. I reached out and gripped Silas's shoulder, shaking him gently at first, then with a desperate urgency. Silas, it's Dad. Open your eyes, son. I whispered, my voice cracking under the strain of 1,000 unsaid apologies. For a long, terrifying minute, there was no response, only the shallow, ragged whistle of his breathing. Then his eyelids fluttered. He groaned a low animal sound of pain before his eyes finally found mine. They were bloodshot and unfocused, dancing with the chemical fog of a dozen different neuroleptics. Dad, he rasped the word, barely a ghost of a sound. But she said the IRS took you. She said the stress was too much. She said you died in the county ward months ago. The cruelty of the lie was a physical blow to my chest. Leonie hadn't just taken his freedom. She had tried to erase the only reason he had to keep fighting. I leaned closer, my forehead nearly touching his. I'm right here, Silas. I never left. We're gonna get you out of this hole. I pulled the Nokia phone from my vest, my fingers moving with a cold, tactical precision. I hit the recording button and aimed the lens at the IV bag, ensuring the label was clear. Neuroleptics, high-dose sedatives. I panned the camera down to the leather cuffs biting into his emaciated wrists. The skin there rubbed raw and weeping. I narrated the findings in a flat clinical monotone, the same voice I used to document the failure of the Silver Bridge. Patient is Silas Vance. Evidence of prolonged chemical restraint and unauthorized remote medical devices. I was documenting their death warrants. Silas watched me, a flicker of the old Vance grit returning to his gaze. I hear him, Dad, Silas whispered, his eyes darting toward the door. The vulture is coming for his morning meal. Faulkner, just as he spoke, the muffled sound of Doctor. Emmerich's distinctive arrogant laughter echoed from the hallway, growing louder with every second. He was talking to someone, his voice full of the easy confidence of a man who thinks he's already won. I had the evidence. The recording was saved to the Nokia's internal drive, but the room was a dead end. Dad Silas breathed, his voice rising in panic. The photo. The one she showed you of the accident in the Alps. It wasn't Zurich. They took it in the basement garden here. They used a snow machine from the resort's planning office. The lie was total. Every piece of data Leonie had fed me was a manufactured structural failure. The door handle turned, the heavy lock clicking back, with a sound like a guillotine blade being released. I had exactly 3 seconds to vanish or become patient 305. I looked at the small square opening of the laundry chute in the corner of the room, the only exit that didn't lead into Emmerich's arms. The heavy metallic thud of a distant security door closing signaled the doctor was just outside. I gave Silas's hand one last squeeze, a silent promise of fire and blood, and lunged for the chute. The metal lip of the laundry chute was cold against my palms, a vertical escape tunnel that offered a choice between a broken neck and a life in chains. I didn't hesitate. As the door handle to room 304 turned with a heavy final click, I threw myself forward head first into the galvanized darkness. The transition from the sterile room to the raw metallic interior of the chute was instantaneous. I hurtled downward, the screech of metal on metal echoing in my ears like a dying suspension cable. My old DOT safety vest snagged on a stray rivet, the fabric tearing with a sharp rip that vibrated against my spine, but gravity was a relentless inspector, pulling me deeper into the gut of the facility. As I plummeted through the dark, my hand brushed against a heavy rectangular object, sitting on an internal ledge, a discarded patient logbook that someone had carelessly left in the bin path. My fingers clamped onto it by pure instinct. Falling through that chute was like the structural failure of a suspension cable, terrifying, messy, and irreversible. I slammed into the basement level with a jarring impact that felt like a bridge collapse in my own ribcage. Fortunately, I landed on a mountain of soiled linens that smelled of industrial detergent and stale sweat, a soft landing that saved my 69-year-old frame from total destruction. I scrambled out of the bin, my heart hammering against my lungs, just as a voice crackled over a nearby intercom. "Check the chute!" Something heavy just went down. "Not today, you vultures. Not today." I rolled onto the concrete floor, clutching the Nokia and the stolen logbook to my chest like holy relics. I moved through the basement, navigating a labyrinth of steam pipes and electrical conduits that hissed and hummed with a life of their own. I found a roll-up garage door near the back, the kind used for hazardous waste removal. The metal was rusted and heavy, but I heaved it upward just enough to squeeze my body through the iron, scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to carry for miles. I tumbled out into the cold mud and the lashing rain of the facility's backside. The air here was sharp with the scent of wet pine and ozone. I realized I was now in the dead zone, the unlit forest sector between the high security building and the perimeter fence. The rain was ice. The dogs were fire. Almost immediately, the silence of the woods was shattered by the deep guttural barking of K9 units. They knew I was out. I pushed myself up my knees, screaming in protest. But my heart was louder, a frantic drumbeat of survival. I began to sprint, or at least the closest thing to a sprint my body could manage, through the dense underbrush. I used my knowledge of bridge culverts to navigate a steep drainage ravine, sliding down the muddy banks and clawing my way back up the other side. The wet slap of paws on the mud was getting closer, a rhythmic sound that chilled me more than the rain. I could hear the hot, heavy breath of the pursuing dogs, the sound of the hunt narrowing the world down to the next 10 feet of darkness. How does a sheriff justify using attack dogs on a grandfather? The question burned in my mind as I reached the chain-link perimeter fence. I could see the road through the mesh, a ribbon of wet asphalt that offered the only hope of escape. I braced myself to climb my fingers, digging into the cold wire, when a pair of headlights cut through the trees like twin searchlights. A white delivery van tore down the access road, smashing through the service gate in a brilliant shower of sparks and the scream of twisting metal. The side door slid open with a violent bang. "Jump Alaric. Get in the damn van!" Merritt's voice was a clarion call. I didn't wait. I lunged toward the moving vehicle, my boots slipping in the blinding spray of mud from the tires. Merritt leaned out his massive hand, grabbing the collar of my torn safety vest and hauling me into the interior with a single powerful heave. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, the smell of gun oil and stale coffee in the van feeling like the most beautiful scent in the world. "I've got the phone, Merritt." I gasped, holding up the Nokia. "I've got the proof, and I've got a logbook that's going to bury them all." Merritt didn't respond. He just slammed the van into gear and hit 80 on the mountain road, the engine roaring in defiance of the storm. I looked out the back window as the facility shrank into the distance. In the strobe-like flashes of the storm's lightning, I saw a blacked-out SUV pull to a stop by the broken gate. A figure stepped out into the rain, Sheriff Vesta. I watched as she personally released a second pair of dogs, her badge glinting with a cold, reflected light as she pointed toward our retreating taillights. She wasn't just ignoring the crime, she was leading the manhunt with a professional bloodlust that turned my stomach. I clutched the Nokia and the stolen logbook to my chest as Merritt hit 80 on the mountain road, knowing that by tomorrow morning I would either be a hero or a headline. The van door had shut with a heavy metallic thud, sealing us in our mobile war room. I looked at the logbook in the dim light of the dashboard. It was a physical record of every permanent sedation performed in the last year, a list of names that Leonie and Faulkner had turned into ghosts. I wasn't just a father looking for his son anymore. I was the sole witness to a mass grave and the only person standing between the sheriff and the total erasure of the truth. I watched the rain wash the clinic's mud from my old safety vest, but no amount of water could rinse away the image burned into my mind. My son's skeletal wrists locked tight inside those leather restraints. The rain slid down in thin, uneven streams dripping from the frayed edges of the vest, but the memory clung to me with a weight far heavier than water. It stayed, sharp, unforgiving, permanent. We had stopped at a roadside diner just outside the Highlands town limits, not because it was safe, but because I needed a moment to take inventory not of the physical damage, but of the structural integrity of everything that was left inside me. The flickering fluorescent light above our booth buzzed with a weak dying hum, the kind that made the air feel unstable, as if the room itself was struggling to hold together. I sat heavily the cracked vinyl seat sighing under my weight and pulled the Nokia phone and the stolen logbook close to my chest. I held them there like they were load-bearing supports in a bridge that had already lost too many joints. My hands trembled, not from weakness, not anymore, from anger. Cold, controlled anger, the kind that doesn't explode outward but builds inward, reinforcing itself until it becomes something unbreakable. Merritt stood by the window, his reflection faint in the glass as he watched the empty parking lot. His posture was still, but his awareness wasn't. His eyes moved constantly, scanning shadows, tracking movement, measuring distance. "We don't stay," he said quietly. I nodded. He didn't need to explain. We both understood the same principle: a static position becomes a target. We left before the waitress returned. By the time I reached the Highland Sheriff Station, the adrenaline from the forest still surged through me, sharp and electric, making every sound louder, every movement more defined. The building stood quiet under the night sky, its lights soft and steady, presenting itself as something stable. But I had spent my life evaluating structures, and I knew the difference between appearance and integrity. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, clean, controlled, artificial. It was the scent of a place designed to reassure, but reassurance is easy to fabricate. Truth is not. Sheriff Vesta York sat behind her desk, leaning back slightly. Her posture relaxed in a way that told me she was already several steps ahead of whatever I was about to say. Her uniform was crisp. Her badge gleamed under the light. Everything about her said control. I didn't wait. I slammed the Nokia onto her desk. The screen lit up instantly, bathing her face in a cold blue glow. "Look at the IV bag," I shouted. "He's being drugged. Room 304. Vesta, they're killing him." She didn't move, didn't lean forward, didn't react. Her eyes shifted from the phone to me, and in that moment, something inside me dropped into place. Because I saw it, the folder, sitting neatly on the edge of her desk. My medical report, the fake one, stamped, signed, prepared, waiting. She had the lie ready. Before I brought her the truth. "Alaric," she said calmly, her voice smooth, almost patient. "You need to go to the motel I arranged." I stared at her. "You're confused," she continued. "This is part of your episode." Episode. That word hit harder than any accusation. It reframed everything. It erased context. It rewrote reality. "This video," she added, gesturing lightly toward the phone, "is a hallucination." And just like that, the structure revealed itself. A corrupt sheriff doesn't need to threaten. She controls the narrative. She decides what is real and what is dismissed. I felt something settle inside me, not panic, not fear. Clarity. I wasn't standing in a place of law. I was standing inside a controlled system, and I had just been identified as an error within it. She warned me, quietly. If I continued, If I pushed, if I questioned if I returned, I would be the one in handcuffs. I backed out of the station slowly, each step heavier than the last, the air pressing against my chest, like the structure itself was trying to compress me into silence. Every local support, gone, every trusted beam, compromised. I had one option left. The homestead, the original deed, the tax records hidden beneath the floorboards, physical proof, untouched, immutable. Merritt dropped me at the base of the drive. The rain had turned sharper colder, each drop cutting through my clothes like fine needles. I climbed the road I had built myself every step, carrying the weight of memory of years spent shaping something that now stood against me. The Vance homestead rose out of the storm, dark, silent. For a moment, I let myself believe it still belonged to me. Then I reached the door, and reality corrected me. No keyhole, just a digital lock. Red, cold, final. I stared at it, then at the key in my hand. Useless, obsolete. I knocked, hard. The sound vanished into thunder. Leonie stepped into the light, wrapped in cashmere, holding a mug of tea like she was watching a performance she had already rehearsed. "This is my house," I shouted. "I built this." She didn't react, didn't shift, didn't hesitate. "It was your house," she said softly. Past tense. Controlled. Absolute. "Now it's a liability we're managing." The words landed with surgical precision. She told me about the protection order. 500 feet. A legal perimeter. A boundary enforced not by walls, but by authority. Behind her, I saw Kezia, watching, smiling. Then the curtains closed. And with them, any illusion of entry. The flashing lights came next. Blue, red, cutting through the rain like sharp signals of control. Vesta arrived. Calm, routine, like she was processing paperwork. She told me I was trespassing. On land owned by Leonie's company. She told me to leave. And I did. Not because I agreed, but because I understood the structure. I was no longer part of it. My boots slipped as I walked down my own driveway, the wet ground shifting beneath me, unstable, unfamiliar. How much does rain weigh, I thought, when there's no roof left to carry it? At the road I stopped. Turned back. "You're making a mistake," I said. "A federal one." She didn't respond. The gates closed. Locked. Final. Then I saw it. Inside Leonie's car, a stack of signs. Notice of sale. Clean. Printed. Prepared. The auction was already scheduled, already in motion. They weren't just taking everything. They were converting it, liquidating it, before I was even gone. I stood there in the rain, the cold soaking through every layer, but I didn't move. Because something had shifted. They thought they had removed me from the system. They thought local control was enough, but they forgot something fundamental. Every structure connects to something larger. When local supports fail, you escalate. I reached inside my jacket, feeling the burner phone and the logbook pressed against my chest. If the county wouldn't listen, then I would speak to the system that moves everything. The system that doesn't care about influence. The system that doesn't bend. The system that delivers truth, whether you want it or not. The mail. Task 5.2. I didn't knock on the glass doors of the federal building. I leaned my weight against them, instead, a mud-stained ghost from the past, demanding an audience with the only authority Leonie couldn't bribe. The long, shivering walk toward the Asheville city limits had stripped away the last of my physical warmth, leaving only a cold, vibrating core of purpose behind. It wasn't strength. It wasn't courage. It was something simpler and far more dangerous. It was resolve. My safety vest clung to me, soaked and heavy, no longer a badge of my profession, but a relic of a life that had already been dismantled piece by piece. The mountain mud had dried into a gray crust along my boots, cracking slightly with each step as I crossed into the sterile lobby. The bright overhead lights reflected harshly against the polished floor, making everything feel unreal, almost artificial, like I had stepped out of one world and into another that didn't quite believe I belonged. It was 3 a.m., the kind of hour when lies lose their confidence and truth feels closer to the surface. The night guard rose from his chair, his expression shifting from bored indifference to mild suspicion. He looked at me the way anyone would a disheveled old man who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't let him speak. Alden checked my badge number. I said, my voice dry, but steady enough to carry weight. Shield 4922, Section 1341, violation. I need a duty postal inspector immediately. The effect was immediate. Those weren't random words. They were system triggers. The guard's posture changed instantly, his skepticism dissolving into alert focus. He didn't question me. He didn't hesitate. Instead, he reached for the phone behind him, his movements precise, now controlled. Codes like that weren't guessed. They were earned. 15 minutes later, the reinforced glass door buzzed open. Inspector Alden Brooks stepped through. He stopped when he saw me. For a brief moment, his composure slipped. "Alaric," he said quietly. There was disbelief in his voice, recognition, and beneath it something heavier, concern. "What happened to the man who built the newfound gap bridge?" he added. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat down heavily in the plastic chair, my damp clothes leaving a dark imprint behind me. The room was quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights, a steady mechanical sound that made everything feel contained, controlled, almost surgical. Then I began. Not a story, a structure. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, the stolen logbook, the Nokia phone, the patterns, the connections. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require performance. Alden listened carefully, his eyes shifting between the documents and the data he was already pulling up. I could see it happening in real time, the moment isolated suspicions began connecting, forming something undeniable. "We've been tracking her firm," he said finally. "Interstate land flips, shell transactions." He paused. "But we didn't have enough to move. A predicate act, a legal anchor." This, he said, tapping the logbook lightly, "changes that." I nodded slowly. "Logistics is the nervous system of a nation," I said. "You poison the mail, and eventually the entire system reacts." Alden's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. "Title 18, Section 1341, he muttered. "Mail fraud." He looked up. "That's federal." A pause. "That's leverage." But then his expression tightened. "There's a problem." I didn't need him to finish. "If the final deed reaches Chicago," he nodded, "it gets registered, and once it's registered, it becomes a legal structure we can't dismantle quickly." Time. That was the variable we didn't have. Silas didn't have time. "We intercepted," I said. Alden leaned forward slightly. "How?" I closed my eyes for a brief moment and remembered the blue envelopes, heavy bond, official, trusted. "I saw them on her desk," I said. "Priority transfers." Alden didn't hesitate. He moved immediately. Orders were issued. Authorization pushed through. Within minutes, we were moving fast, coordinated, efficient. By the time we reached the Asheville Regional Sorting Facility, the sky was still dark, the early morning fog clinging low to the ground, like something reluctant to let go of the night. The building itself rose out of that fog like a machine given form, steel, glass, and motion. Inside, the air hit me instantly. Ozone, ink, heat, the constant vibration of machinery running at full capacity. We climbed onto the catwalk, the cold metal railing biting into my hands as I looked down. Below us, a river, white envelopes. Blue envelopes, thousands of them moving at once. Each one following a path defined by algorithms, by routing systems, by logic that didn't care about human consequence. "Route 48B, I shouted over the noise. "Belt 6. Alden signaled to the supervisor. "I hope your memory still works," he said. I didn't respond. My focus had narrowed completely. Scanning, tracking, filtering. 40 years of experience condensed into instinct. Patterns became visible. Irregularities stood out. And then I saw it, a flash of blue, heavier, moving differently, not tumbling like the rest. "That's it," I said. But as we moved toward the stairs, something else caught my attention. Movement near the loading dock. A courier, a driver, a digital manifest. I narrowed my eyes and felt the cold realization settle in. The signature, Mark, the orderly. From the sanctuary. "They're inside the system," I said quietly. Alden followed my gaze. Moles. Not just corruption, integration. The system hadn't been compromised. It had been infiltrated. That changed everything. The belts surged faster, louder, the rhythm intensifying as the next cycle began. Time compressed. 60 seconds, maybe less. If that envelope made it onto that truck, it would be gone. Not misplaced, not delayed, gone, beyond reach, beyond correction. I tightened my grip on the railing, feeling the cold metal dig into my palm. Because I understood something now, with absolute clarity. This wasn't just about a document. It wasn't just about stopping a crime. It was about stopping a system from being weaponized. And if I failed here, at this exact moment, then everything I had built, everything I had protected, would be carried away in a current I could never reverse. I took a step forward, my body already moving. Because there are moments in life when hesitation is the same as surrender, and I had already lost too much to surrender now. A task 5.3, I dove toward the fast-moving rubber belt, without hesitation, my 69-year-old knees cracking like dry timber under sudden strain as I lunged forward. The sharp pain shot up through my joints, but I didn't slow down. Pain didn't matter. Timing did. The blue envelope flashed past me, riding the conveyor like a projectile locked into a system that didn't care what it carried, only where it needed to go. It was already being pulled toward the long-haul chute, already slipping beyond human reach. 1 second. That was all I had. 1 second before it vanished into a network designed to erase mistakes. And right now, I was the mistake. The sorting floor roared around me louder than anything I had heard in years. The machinery wasn't just running, it was alive. Rubber belts screamed as they dragged against steel rollers. Hydraulic pistons hammered in a relentless rhythm. Robotic arms snapped forward with cold precision, redirecting entire streams of mail without hesitation. It was a system, perfectly indifferent, and I had spent 40 years studying systems just like this. Alden, hold, I shouted over the industrial din. His hand hovered over the emergency stop. One press and everything would freeze. But that would be too slow. Too late. No shutdown, I barked, shaking my head. Watch the cycle. He hesitated, but he trusted me, because I wasn't guessing. I was reading it, the spacing, the flow, the micro delay between each mechanical sweep. Machines don't improvise, they repeat. There, I shouted. Belt 4, next sweep. A robotic arm hissed as it prepared to redirect a cluster of Chicago-bound priority mail. That was the opening. Half a second. I moved. My body reacted before thought instinct, overriding age, fear, and pain. My fingers scraped against the rough rubber surface of the conveyor, friction biting into my skin as I reached. And caught it. The envelope resisted, pulled forward by the machine's momentum. For a brief, dangerous moment, my body tilted forward, dragged toward the belt, as if the system itself was trying to reclaim what I had taken. But I held, planted, pulled back. I've got it, I shouted, my voice raw. I've got the damn thing. The envelope tore free just inches before disappearing into the chute. For a moment, everything slowed. The sound dulled. The motion blurred. I stood there breathing hard, clutching the envelope against my chest as if it might disappear if I loosened my grip. I had it. The truth. The evidence. The fracture point. But then, something caught my eye. A second slip of paper, barely visible, tucked into the corner. I slid it out carefully, and the world shifted again. Wire transfer. Cayman Islands. I stared at it, my mind already assembling the structure behind it. She's not just stealing, I said quietly. Alden stepped beside me. She's exiting, he replied. That was the difference. This wasn't greed. It was abandonment. She wasn't planning to win. She was planning to disappear. The land, the money, the people, all of it, left behind like debris after demolition. This is it, I murmured. This is where it fails. Because every system, every structure has a breaking point. And I had just found hers. We moved fast. Inside the secure processing room, the noise vanished behind thick glass, replaced by sterile silence and blinding white light that made everything feel exposed, undeniable. Alden didn't hesitate. He opened the envelope. The sharp snap echoed in the room, like a fracture under stress. Inside, the new will. My name, my signature, my life. Rewritten. I leaned forward, my mind shifting instantly into analysis. Emotion could wait. This was inspection. Look at the signature, I said. Alden followed my finger. There it was. My name. But wrong. She copied the tremor, I said. The jagged loops. The uneven pressure. The deliberate instability. She studied it, I added. Practiced it. But that was her mistake. A real tremor isn't consistent. It fluctuates. Breaks pattern. This was controlled. Too controlled. She overcorrected, I said quietly. Alden shifted to the notary. Arthur Vance. The name hit me like a distant memory. That can't be right. Alden checked. His fingers moved quickly, then stopped. He looked at me. Dead, he said. 3 years. Silence settled over the room. Cold. Heavy. She forged a dead man's credentials, I said slowly. Reused the system. Layered fraud. Calculated. Engineered. A machine doesn't care about intent, I said, staring at the document. It only reads what's fed into it. I looked up. But today, I tapped the envelope lightly. I decide what gets processed. The ink was still fresh, still alive, still carrying her intent like a pulse. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of it settle fully. This wasn't personal anymore. This was federal. Alden moved to the secure phone. His voice changed immediately. Lower, sharper, command level. He made the calls. Federal judges. Multi-state coordination. Bypassing local authority entirely. Cutting around corruption, like removing a compromised beam before it brought down the entire structure. He listed everything. The intercepted mail. The forged notary. The offshore transfer. The medical evidence. Every piece. Every layer. I watched him feeling something shift, not inside me, but around me. The system was moving, slow, massive, but unstoppable once engaged. He hung up, turned to me. The judge signed. A pause. Title 18, Section 1341. Mail fraud, federal jurisdiction. It's a lock. Another breath. We have a no-knock warrant. Immediate. Multi-agency. Final. I nodded slowly. It was never about the money, I said. My voice was steady now. It was about control. Alden held my gaze. And now you have it. Silas. Room 304. Strapped down. Monitored. Waiting. That image didn't leave my mind. Alden began sealing the documents into an evidence bag. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. Alaric. He slid the envelope back toward me. Look at the return address. I read it, and everything aligned. Sheriff Vesta York. The room felt colder. She's not protecting the operation, I said. She is the operation. Logistics, distribution, execution. She wasn't outside the system. She was embedded in it. I stared at the federal seal on the warrant. And for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel hunted. I felt anchored. The currents shifting, I said quietly. Alden checked his sidearm. We move in 1 hour. He looked at me. But we need them calm. Pause. No panic. We both understood. The IV pump. One wrong move. And Silas would never leave that room. I reached for the burner phone. Cold. Light. Decisive. I'll make the call, I said. Because this was the last step. The final alignment. The moment everything balanced or collapsed, the safe room fell silent again. Only the low hum of machines remained. I stared at the phone, at the number, at the woman who had dismantled my life, piece by piece. Every collapse starts with something small. A crack, a weakness, a flaw. She left hers in the mail. And now, I was going to widen it, slowly, deliberately, until every piece of her structure failed at once. Until there was nothing left to hold it together. Until the system she trusted became the force that destroyed her. I lifted the phone, and this time, I wasn't calling as a victim. I was calling as the man who was about to deliver the final load. Task 6.1, I stared at the black plastic of the receiver for a long moment before lifting it, fully aware that what I was about to do required a different kind of strength than anything I had faced before. Not physical strength, not endurance, but something colder. To save my son, I had to lie. And not just any lie. I had to deceive a woman who had spent the last 2 years perfecting deception as both weapon and shield, refining it until it was indistinguishable from truth. The silence inside the federal safe room pressed against my ears like altitude pressure, heavy and constant. It wasn't empty, it was loaded. Every hum, every faint vibration from the recording equipment seemed amplified in the stillness. The low murmur of technicians working in the adjacent room blended into a steady background noise like distant machinery, keeping something enormous in motion. Inspector Alden Brooks stood behind the glass partition, his arms folded, his eyes locked on me. When I glanced up, he gave me a short, firm nod. Not encouragement, confirmation. This was happening. I drew in a slow breath, tasting the cold, recycled air of the basement briefing room. It felt sterile, stripped of life, as if even oxygen had been filtered down to its most basic components. Then I dialed the number. Each digit had been memorized long ago, burned into my mind during the weeks I had spent wandering through the fog she created. The line rang once, twice. On the third ring, it clicked open. Alaric. Leonie's voice came through sharp, jagged, edged with suspicion. It wasn't relief. It wasn't surprise. It was calculation. I thought Vesta made it very clear you weren't to make contact. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and stepped fully into the role I had rehearsed. I have nothing left, Leonie, I whispered, letting my voice fracture, forcing a tremor into every word. I'm out here. Asheville. I've been sleeping on the street. I let a breath hitch, a controlled break. I'm cold, I added, and I'm tired of fighting. Across the room, I saw the technicians immediately lean in, their hands flying across keyboards. Data streams lit up the monitors. They weren't just listening, they were hunting. You win, I said. Those 2 words carried more weight than anything else. I'll sign everything. The 65 acres, the resort waiver, the trust, all of it. Silence. Heavy. Measured. I could almost hear her thinking. The lie was the cable, and she was pulling on it. Why now, Alaric? She asked slowly. But the suspicion in her voice had changed. It was still there, but beneath it something else had surfaced. Greed. Because I want to see my boy. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice, making it raw, desperate. Just once I said, "Let me see Silas. At the house. Let me say goodbye." I paused. After that, I disappeared. Behind the glass, Alden's team moved faster. One of them pointed at a screen, another nodded. They were using the duration of this call to plant a high-frequency tracking burst into her phone, a digital tag that would lead them straight to Faulkner's hidden operations. The Trojan horse wasn't just me. It was the signal. The longer she stayed on the line, the deeper the hook set. "Be at the house," she said finally. "Noon, the 20th. Her tone sharpened. "And Alaric," I waited. "If you're even 1 minute late, or if I see so much as a patrol car within 5 miles. A pause. Controlled. Silas goes back to the clinic. The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was absolute. The line went dead. I lowered the receiver, slowly placing it back into its cradle with deliberate care. Alden stepped into the room immediately. "We've got her," one of the texts said. "Signal's clean. Tracking is live." Alden looked at me. "Now we finish it. A lie is like a tension cable. Pull it too tight and it snaps." But Leonie, she wasn't just pulling. She was anchoring herself to it. October 18th. 2 days before the meeting, I stood in the tactical operations room, surrounded by flickering drone feeds and digital overlays of my own land. The room smelled of stale coffee gun oil and long hours in an environment built for decisions that didn't allow hesitation. The SWAT leader stood over the table, his presence solid, immovable. His jawline was set like carved stone, his eyes scanning the map, not as terrain, but as a sequence of breach points. "This is not a rescue mission," he said flatly. He pointed to the perimeter. "It's an execution of federal justice." The laser traced the tree line marking positions. "Teams will be in place here, here, and here. Dense cover, no visibility." He looked at me. "We move the moment you give the signal." Alden stepped forward, placing a small transmitter into my hand. "You'll be wired," he said. "We need her confession. Clear, undeniable." His voice lowered slightly. "Once Silas is physically in the room, and you confirm he's alive." He held my gaze. "You say the phrase certified delivery." I nodded slowly. "The hammer, that was the hammer." I turned my attention to the drone feed. My roof, my porch, my land. Seen from above, it didn't look like home. It looked like a target. Then I saw it. Movement. In the barn. I leaned closer. "Those aren't ours," I said. The SWAT leader didn't hesitate. "No," he replied. "They're not. Sheriff Vesta's private team, positioned, waiting, not to protect, to eliminate." The moment the papers were signed, I wouldn't leave that house alive. The trap had layers. But so did ours. By the night of the 19th, everything was in place. Merritt stood behind me in the equipment room, adjusting the Kevlar vest beneath my flannel shirt. The rough scratch of the Velcro echoed louder than it should have in the quiet space. "It's tighter than your old safety vest," he said. I let out a slow breath. "It's heavier," I replied. "Not because of the plates, because of what it meant." Merritt met my eyes. No words. Just understanding. He had been cleared to operate with the perimeter team, guiding them through terrain we both knew better than anyone. "You come back," he said finally. "Not a question. A statement." I checked the microphone one last time, feeling the wire secured against my chest. The red light blinked. Steady. Alive. I looked at the equipment cases, the weapons, the cold steel, and precise preparation. I wasn't inspecting structures anymore. I was stepping into a demolition. Every piece of Leonie's plan was now under surveillance. Every exit covered. Every weakness identified. I thought about Silas, about his hollow eyes, his shaking hands, and in that moment, the fear disappeared, replaced by something else. Something colder. Resolve. Tomorrow was October 20th. The day she thought she would win. The day she planned to take everything. The day she believed I would finally break. But I wasn't walking into my grave. I was walking into the final inspection. And this time, I wasn't there to measure the damage. I was there to make sure the collapse was complete. I stood on my own front porch and waited for the woman who had stolen my life to invite me inside. That alone should have been enough to tell anyone watching that something in the world had shifted out of alignment. A man should never have to ask permission to enter the house. He built the land he defended. the place where his name had been carved into the foundation long before greed ever found its way through the door. And yet, there I was, waiting. My fingers twitched not with the frailty of age I had spent months performing, but with something far more dangerous. A contained energy, a pressure building beneath the surface like steel under strain, just moments before it gives way. Every step I had taken up that gravel driveway echoed differently that night. The crunch beneath my boots wasn't just sound. It felt like resistance, like something objecting to my return. It reminded me of bone under stress of structures forced to bear weight they were never designed to carry. I paused just before the threshold. My hand brushed lightly against my chest, feeling for the small, concealed microphone taped beneath the fabric. The tiny red indicator pulsed steadily, a quiet artificial heartbeat layered over my own. 2 rhythms, one for survival, one for truth. Out beyond the porch hidden in the tree line, I knew they were already in place. Federal agents silent and patient, waiting for the signal. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence like tension in a suspension cable held controlled, ready to snap into action. And somewhere out there, Merritt, watching, unmoving, the kind of man who didn't need instructions twice. The door opened. Sheriff Vesta York stood framed in the doorway. Her posture relaxed, her expression already shaped into that familiar cutting smirk. She looked at me the way predators look at something they've already decided is too weak to fight back. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Took you long enough." She stepped forward and ran her hands over me in what was supposed to pass as a search. It wasn't thorough. It wasn't careful. It was lazy. Arrogance. That was her flaw. Her fingers skimmed over the fabric of my flannel shirt, missing everything that mattered: the wire, the Kevlar, the truth sitting inches beneath her hand. "Clean," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Let him in." I didn't answer, didn't look at her. I let my shoulders sag, my eyes dull, my movements slow and uncertain. I let her believe what she wanted to believe, because belief is the most dangerous blind spot of all. I stepped past her and into my own house. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it immediately. Wrong. Not broken, not yet, but altered. The air felt colder, thinner, like something essential had been stripped away and replaced with something artificial. My study was no longer mine. The bookshelves that had once held decades of knowledge had been pushed aside. My blueprints, maps of bridges of load-bearing systems of careful precision, were stacked carelessly like they no longer held value. In their place stood something sterile, controlled, a command center. Leonie sat behind my desk. She leaned back slightly in the chair, her posture effortless, her presence dominating the room like she had always belonged there. She didn't look like an intruder. She looked like ownership. To her right stood Dr. Emmerich Faulkner, composed and clinical, carrying with him the faint scent of antiseptic and polished wood, a man who treated human lives like controlled experiments. To her left sat Elias Trent, the shark, perfect suit, perfect posture, but his eyes betrayed him. They moved too much. Window, door, floor. He clutched his briefcase tightly, his fingers tense. He knew. He might not have known everything, but he knew enough to be afraid. "I just want to see my son," I said quietly. I let my voice tremble, let it crack just enough. The broken man. Leonie studied me for a moment, then gave a small dismissive nod. Faulkner signaled. The door opened again, and then Silas. They wheeled him in like he wasn't a person, like he was an object, something already halfway gone. The sight of him hit me harder than anything that had come before. His body looked smaller, shrunken. The suit he wore hung off him like it didn't belong, like it had been chosen for someone else, someone healthier, someone alive. His skin was pale, too pale. His eyes, empty, glassy, lost behind whatever chemical fog Faulkner had forced into his system. I moved to him immediately, dropping beside the wheelchair, gripping his hand. Cold, too cold. "Silas," I whispered, leaning close enough that my voice became something only he could hear. "Can you hear me?" His fingers twitched, slight, uncertain, but real. "Stay with me," I murmured, "just a little longer." Leonie's voice cut through the moment, sharp, impatient. "He's fine," she said, "just tired." Tired. That word again. As if what had been done to him was something ordinary. "Sign the papers, Alaric," she continued. "Then he can rest?" I turned slowly, looked at the desk. The documents were laid out neatly, deliberately, final transfer papers, legal waivers, everything she needed to take the last piece. Everything. She pushed a gold fountain pen toward me. It gleamed under the light. Heavy. Phenol. I reached for it, let my hand shake violently. The pen slipped, clattered loudly against the desk. I can't, I stammered. My mind, it's all fog. Leonie laughed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that echoed unnaturally through the room. Pathetic, she said. She stood, walked toward me slowly. Confident, certain. You spent your entire life finding weaknesses, she said. Cracks in steel, fault lines in structures. She leaned closer. And you never saw the one in your own house. Her smile widened. You were too slow to die, she added softly. So I helped you. And then she told me everything. The poisoning, the medication swaps, the falsified reports, the manipulation. She spoke like someone recounting a brilliant design, proud of every calculated step. I used your love for your son, she said. That was the flaw. I felt something shift inside me. Not break, settle. Why, I asked. My voice changed. No tremor, no weakness. Just steel. Why destroy a family for a parking lot? Her eyes hardened. Because land doesn't betray you, she said. People do. She leaned in even closer. And because it was easy. Then came the final strike. I've already moved your pension funds, she said. Everything inside me went still. Your department, she added. Your colleagues. She smiled. They'll retire with nothing. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Final. I looked at her. And for the first time, I let her see me. The real me. I stood up, slowly, deliberately. The weakness disappeared. Her expression changed. Confusion. Fear. Just a flicker. But enough. The man she thought she had broken had never been gone. I reached for the microphone at my collar. My eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, everything aligned. The bridges I had inspected. The failures I had studied. The lessons I had learned. And the son beside me, still breathing. Still holding. This was it. The final inspection. Task 6.3. I didn't reach for the pen. That would have been the old version of me, the man who documented, who measured, who wrote reports after the damage had already been done. No. This time, I reached for the microphone, clipped discreetly against my ribs, my fingers steady precise. When I spoke, my voice cut through Leonie's smug laughter like a hacksaw biting into a rusted bolt. Slow grinding, but absolutely unstoppable. The silence that followed her confession was not empty. It was pressure, heavy, suffocating. The kind of silence that settles over a bridge seconds before it collapses, when the load has exceeded what the structure can bear, but the failure hasn't yet announced itself. I stood up, perfectly straight. The faint tremor I had been performing carefully, deliberately vanished, as if it had never existed. My hands steadied, my breathing leveled, and when I looked at Leonie, I didn't see a predator anymore. I saw a fault line. I believe this is a certified delivery. Leonie, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the authority of a man who had finally reclaimed his foundation, who knew exactly where every beam stood and exactly which ones were about to fail. The trigger phrase had barely left my mouth when the world outside the study detonated into motion. The front windows exploded inward. Glass shattered in a violent cascade, thousands of fragments catching the light, like diamonds as they rained across the Persian rug. The sound was sharp, violent, absolute, a rupture. Then came the flashbangs, a concussive boom that slammed into the room, followed by a blinding white light that swallowed everything. Except me. Because I had already closed my eyes. I had calculated the timing, prepared for the breach. When I opened them again, the room had transformed. Federal agents flooded in disciplined, fast, overwhelming. Their boots struck the hardwood in synchronized impact, each step echoing like a gavel hitting wood. Judgment. Federal agents. Down on the ground. Hands where we can see them. Their voices overlapped, sharp and commanding, cutting through the haze of smoke that now filled the study, carrying that acrid metallic scent of detonated charges. Leonie was still laughing when it happened, or trying to. An agent grabbed her, slamming her face first into the wall. Her expensive cardigan snagged on a jagged edge of a shattered frame fabric, tearing as easily as her control over the situation. "This is illegal!" she screamed, her voice cracking under pressure. "You can't do this." But her words had already lost their power. Across the room, Dr. Emmerich Faulkner, the man who had clinically measured my son's decline like he was documenting a controlled demolition, lunged for his leather medical bag. Desperation. His fingers clawed at the zipper, reaching for a syringe. A last attempt at control. He didn't even get it open. Two agents tackled him hard, slamming him into the floor with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. His designer glasses flew from his face, skidding across the glass-littered floor until they disappeared beneath the desk. The vulture had been grounded. I watched it all with the detached clarity of an inspector, not reacting, not intervening, just observing. Because this wasn't chaos, it was correction. Elias Trent, the so-called shark lawyer, had already abandoned his briefcase. The man who once spoke in calculated threats was now curled beneath my desk, his expensive suit covered in dust and shards. Survival instinct. He peeked out his face, pale, his voice trembling. "I have the files," he shouted. "I have everything records transactions. They're hidden in the lining of the case. I'll testify. I'll cooperate. A rat." Abandoning the ship before it even finished sinking. Outside, the night had erupted into flashing color. Through the jagged void where my window once stood, I saw the driveway flooded with red and blue strobes cutting through the mountain darkness like warning beacons. Sheriff Vesta York stood there frozen for a moment too long. Then her world collapsed. State agents, clean untouched by the local corruption, moved in with precision. They disarmed her, swiftly stripping the badge from her uniform. She didn't resist. Not really, because deep down she knew. A badge without honor is just a piece of metal. And in that moment, it looked very small. "You old fool," Leonie screamed behind me, her voice muffled as she struggled against the wall. "You think this changes anything I own this land? I have the deeds I have." Everything. I turned to her slowly, walked toward her, each step deliberate, measured. "You have a federal indictment for mail fraud, Leonie," I said calmly. I leaned in close enough that she could see it in my eyes. "The truth. Your sentence," I added quietly, "is already on its way." I straightened. No returns. Inspector Alden Brooks entered through the smoke, his presence cutting clean through the chaos. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. He walked directly to the desk, reached down, picked up something small, and turned to me. The brass mailbox keys, original, recovered. He placed them in my hand. The metal was cold, solid, real. The final rivet. The last piece of a structure being rebuilt. I closed my fingers around them, feeling their weight settle into my palm. Then I turned away. Away from Leonie, away from the noise. And I knelt beside Silas. The federal medics were already there, their movements careful, precise, nothing like the cold efficiency of the people who had once controlled him. His eyes flickered, clearing, breaking through. "Silas," I said softly, gripping his hand. "We're going home." He blinked slowly, confused at first. Then, something else. Recognition. "The real home," I continued, "not the cage she built." They lifted him carefully, transferring him toward the waiting stretcher. As we moved, I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Alden." "We found something else," he said. I followed his gaze. Kezia Platt. She was being escorted out in restraints, but her expression wasn't defeated. It was composed, calculated. "She had a hidden camera in the kitchen," Alden explained. "Recorded everything. The entire confession, insurance. Even among predators, no one trusts anyone completely." "We have it all," he added. I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "Because truth doesn't just survive, it multiplies." I stepped out onto the porch. The night air hit me cold and clean, cutting through the lingering smoke behind me. The convoy began to move, vehicles pulling away one by one, their lights fading into the mountain mist. The war was over. The house behind me was broken, glass-shattered walls scarred the air still heavy with the aftermath. But it was mine again. I reached into my pocket, touching the keys. They didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like a beginning. The house would need repairs, new windows, new locks, time to erase the scent she left behind. But the structure was still sound. I looked up at the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, their dark outlines sharp against the sky. For the first time in a long time, everything was clear. The delivery had been made, the signatures held, the system had responded, and the predators, they were gone. I let the keys fall back into my pocket, the soft metallic click echoing in the quiet. A small sound, but a perfect one. Because I had spent my life building bridges, making sure they held, making sure they carried weight. And today, I had saved the only one that mattered. I turned and walked down the steps toward the ambulance, toward my son, toward the only structure worth rebuilding, one piece at a time. The steady rhythmic beep of the hospital monitor should have been a sound of urgency, of danger, of something hanging by a thread. But to me, it was the first honest heartbeat I had heard in my family in nearly 2 years. It was clean, predictable, real. I sat in the sterile white stillness of the university hospital room, my back slightly hunched, my hands resting on the cool metal railing of Silas's bed. The light filtering through the blinds carried that soft, early morning glow, gentle, almost apologetic, as if the world outside understood that inside this room, time needed to move slower. Outside, life continued in its usual relentless pace. Cars moved, people hurried, deals were made, lies were told. But here time had slowed to something deliberate, something careful, the speed of a fracture healing. Silas lay before me, still and pale, but no longer hollow. That was the difference. Days ago, he had looked like something already lost, like a structure stripped of its internal support. Now there was something returning to him, something rebuilding. The specialist had been working around the clock for 48 hours straight, flushing the cocktail of neuroleptics out of his system. A controlled purge. A chemical war fought silently through IV lines and measured doses. It had not been gentle. His body had trembled. His skin had broken into cold sweats. His breathing had shifted between shallow and ragged. There were moments I had to look away not out of fear, but because I understood exactly what it meant. I had spent my life inspecting damage. And this was deep structural compromise. Detoxing a man is like sandblasting a bridge. It's loud. It's violent. It strips everything down to raw material. But it's the only way to know if the steel underneath still holds. I stayed by his side the entire time. I didn't leave for meals. I didn't leave for rest. The world outside that room could wait, because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where I was supposed to be. My fingers traced absent patterns along the plastic railing. As I sat there, my mind quieter than it had been in months. The keys in my pocket shifted slightly when I moved their weight familiar. But they didn't feel like a burden anymore. They felt like a foundation. I had managed to recover a significant portion of what Leonie had siphoned away, assets scattered across accounts hidden in shell transactions, buried in the kind of paper trails she believed no one would follow all the way through. She had underestimated something. I don't stop at surface-level damage. One of the first things I did with those recovered funds was something small, quiet, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. I settled a debt. Sarah, the bank teller, from the morning in the Highlands. The one who had looked at me not with suspicion, not with indifference, but with something rare, human decency. She had risked her job to show me a fragment of truth when I needed it most. So I paid off her mortgage. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet transaction. A structural repair. Because when the world tries to collapse on you, the only way forward is to reinforce what still stands. By the second day, the color had begun to return to Silas's face. Faint at first, a barely there pink beneath the gray, but it was there. Proof. The system was clearing. The structure was holding. And then he woke. Not the restless, fragmented awareness I had seen before. Not the empty stare of a man trapped behind chemical fog. This time it was different. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, and then they found me. Focused. Clear. Recognizing. "Dad," he whispered. Just one word. But it carried weight. It carried presence. It carried him. I leaned forward, immediately gripping his hand, firm, steady grounding. "I'm right here, Silas," I said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." His fingers tightened around mine. Not weakly, not uncertainly. With strength. A measured, deliberate pressure that told me everything I needed to know. The beams hadn't snapped. "They're gone," I added. "Every single one of them. The vultures are in cages." He let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window. "I can see the mountains again," he murmured. I followed his gaze. "They're not moving," he said softly. "The clouds, they're still." I swallowed, my throat tightening. "That's because they were never supposed to move," I replied. A week later, I found myself standing in the doorway of Merritt Rawlings's apartment. The place was modest, clean, functional. The kind of space built for survival, not comfort. He sat in a chair near the window, flipping through a tactical magazine, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man who never fully turned off his awareness. His injuries were still visible. The cracked ribs had slowed him down, and there was a deep bruise along his shoulder that hadn't fully faded. But his eyes, sharp as ever. Merritt didn't look up immediately when I entered. He didn't need to. He had already registered me. "Door was unlocked," I said. "Would have been disappointed if you knocked," he replied dryly, finally glancing up. That was Merritt. No theatrics, no unnecessary words. Just clarity. I stepped inside and took a seat across from him, placing a document on the coffee table between us. "I'm setting up a permanent trust," I said, "for the homestead. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me. I need someone to watch it, I continued. Not just security, not just presence. I leaned forward slightly. I need an estate warden. He studied me for a moment. Live-in position, I added. Salary that ensures you'll never have to take another night shift job again. Silence hung between us for a few seconds. Then he reached forward, picking up the document. He read it carefully. Every line, every clause, because men like Merritt don't protect things they don't understand. Finally, he looked up. I've spent my whole life guarding things that didn't belong to me, he said. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips. It'll be different, guarding something that does. I nodded. The land needs someone who can't be bought, I said. And you need someone who won't leave, he replied. That was our agreement. No handshake needed. By the time Silas was strong enough to return, the air had shifted. Autumn had settled fully into the mountains, bringing with it that crisp edge that made every breath feel cleaner, sharper. We didn't go inside the house right away. That would come later. Instead, we walked the full perimeter of the land, all 85 acres of it. I showed him the survey stake's bright orange markers, driven deep into the earth, standing out against the muted browns and golds of fallen leaves. These marked the boundaries of the trust, I explained, resting my hand against one of them. This land can't be divided, can't be sold, can't be developed. He ran his fingers along the wood, feeling its roughness. It's permanent, I added. We climbed up toward the north ridge, the highest point overlooking the property. The place where Leonie had planned her centerpiece. Concrete, glass, a lobby where trees once stood. I stopped there, looking out over the canopy. She almost paved this, I said quietly. Silas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he knelt near a large oak, his hands digging into the soil at its base. What are you doing? I asked. I hid something here, he said, years ago, back when everything had first started to feel wrong. He pulled out a small, rusted tobacco tin, prying it open carefully. Inside, something caught the fading light. A ring. My wife's ring. The one Leonie had spent months trying to find. The one she had torn the house apart searching for. And yet, it had never left the land. Silas stood and handed it to me. The roots go deeper than her greed, he said. I looked at the ring in my hand, then at the house below, silent, waiting. We were still standing, and for the first time in a long time. That meant something real. Some task 7.2. I gripped the electric sander with the steady, practiced hand of a man who had spent a lifetime inspecting structures, bridges, beams, joints that determined whether something stood or collapsed. As the machine hummed in my grip, I watched the layer of Leonie's black paint curl away like dead skin, peeling back in brittle flakes to reveal the honest red oak beneath. There was something deeply satisfying in that moment, like uncovering truth after months of deception. The coarse vibration traveled up through my palm, grounding me. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in months lost in a haze of manipulation, displacement, and quiet suffocation. Now, standing here on my own porch again, the scent of raw wood and sawdust filled the air, cutting clean through every lingering trace of that time. Above us, the October sun cast a golden warmth that seemed almost intentional, as if the season itself had chosen this moment to bless our return. The light soaked into the cedar boards, warming them, releasing a scent so familiar it felt like memory made physical. It wasn't just a smell, it was home. Silas worked beside me. His movements had changed. There was strength in them now, confidence. He used a hand scraper along the lower moldings, drawing it slowly, deliberately, each stroke precise. I watched him for a moment, not as a father evaluating a son, but as a man witnessing another man rebuild himself. The focus in his eyes was sharp, unclouded. Whatever had been broken in him, it was healing. I moved the sander along the edge of the heavy doorframe, guiding it into a tight corner where the wood met the stone foundation. As the vibration intensified against the confined space, something shifted, a faint, metallic rattle from within the structure. I stopped immediately. The sudden silence rang louder than the machine had. Carefully, I reached into the narrow, recessed gap, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. I pulled it free, a small, oxidized brass cylinder, no longer than my palm. For a second, I just stared at it. Then I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "It's still here," I said quietly. Silas looked up, wiping his hands on his jeans as he stepped closer. When he saw it, his expression shifted, confusion at first, then recognition, and finally something softer, something almost boyish. "We buried that," he said. 40 years ago," I replied. "Back when he was just a kid, small hands gripping tools too big for him, insisting on helping me set this very frame. We had hidden that brass tube together, a tiny time capsule tucked into the bones of the house. A secret only we knew existed. And somehow, it had survived. Through renovations, through Leonie's sterile corporate redesign, through every attempt to erase what this place meant. She had changed the colors, the furniture, the layout, but she never understood the structure. She never saw what mattered. I handed the cylinder to Silas. We didn't open it. We didn't need to. Whatever was inside, old notes, maybe a childish drawing, it wasn't the point. The memory was enough. The fact that it had endured hidden in the very framework of the house, untouched by everything that tried to overwrite it, that was enough. For a moment, the weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the loss, the anger faded. In its place was something quieter, stronger. Connection. We spent the rest of the morning restoring the entrance, not just repairing wood, but reclaiming space. Every stroke of the brush, every scrape of old paint, every replaced fixture, it was deliberate. We were removing every trace of her influence, every aesthetic lie she had layered over our lives. By midday, the old black door was gone. In its place, we mounted a new one, solid clean, and painted a bold, vibrant red. I dipped my brush into the thick paint, watching it drip slowly before pressing it against the surface. Red means warning in bridge work, I said. It marks fractures, hazards, points of stress. Silas leaned against the railing watching. But on a house, I continued spreading the color evenly. It means something else. It means life. It means welcome. It tells the world the structure is sound and that the master is home. He smiled, then not a forced smile, not the guarded expression I'd grown used to seeing, but something genuine. "It looks like home again, Dad," he said. I stepped back, looking at the finished door, the sunlight catching its surface and making it glow. "Better than it has in years," he added. And for once I believed him without hesitation. As the hours passed, something else began to happen. People noticed. Neighbors drove by slowly, their tires crunching against the gravel road. Some honked softly, others waved. A few even slowed to a near stop, watching as we worked. They weren't just observing repairs. They were witnessing restoration. Not just of a house, but of something larger. A balance that had been disturbed, a structure that had been fractured by greed and deception. Peace, I realized, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the quiet certainty that things are finally where they belong. By the final morning of October, the work was done. I sat on the porch swing, its familiar creak settling into a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The mountains stretched out before us, silent and steady, unchanged by everything that had happened. I checked my watch, 9:15 a.m., right on time. Silas stepped out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea, the condensation already forming on the glass. He handed one to me before sitting down beside me, the swing shifting slightly under our combined weight. "The world's still moving," I said, taking a sip. The cold sweetness cut cleanly through the crisp air. For once, I added, "We're not chasing it." He nodded. On the small tablet resting on the table beside me, a muted news report played. The footage showed Leonie being escorted into a federal facility, dressed in a plain, colorless jumpsuit. She looked smaller, not just physically, but diminished, stripped of the power she once wielded so effortlessly. There was no manic edge to her anymore, no sharp, calculated confidence. Just absence, like a faulty rivet removed from a structure that could finally hold again. I felt no anger watching it. No satisfaction either, just finality. The kind that comes when the inspection is complete, the repairs are tested, and everything holds. Silas leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the north ridge. "All's well that ends well," he murmured. I followed his line of sight. 85 acres of timber stretched out before us, standing tall beneath the autumn sky. To someone like Leonie, it had been nothing more than potential profit, a development opportunity, a resort waiting to be built. But to me, it was legacy. Before the morning passed, I reached for the envelope I had placed beside me earlier and handed it to him. "I made one final adjustment," I said. He opened it, scanning the contents. "I've transferred the land into a permanent environmental conservancy," I explained. "It's locked in. No development, no subdivision, no future deals." I paused. "It's a weld that can't be broken." He looked up at me, understanding settling in. "It belongs to the earth now," I said. "Protected." Silas folded the paper carefully. "It's the right call," he said. "Some things shouldn't be moved." We sat there for a long time after that, watching the sun climb higher, the light catching the red door behind us until it glowed like a beacon. I thought about everything that had led us here, the investigations, the betrayal, the long walk toward justice. Everything breaks eventually. That's just the nature of structures. But what matters is what still stands afterward. And as I sat there feeling the steady rhythm of the swing beneath me, I realized something. We hadn't collapsed. We had bent. We had cracked. We had been pushed further than we should have been. But we held. We adapted. We reinforced. We endured. I closed my eyes, the weight of the old brass mailbox keys resting in my pocket. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to inspect anything. I didn't need to check the joints test, the load question, the stability. I already knew. The structure was sound. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, now a quiet promise of winter on the horizon. But beneath it all, there was warmth. The kind that doesn't come from fire, but from knowing that what was broken has been made honest again. I leaned back, letting the swing carry me gently, the world settling into place around me. For the first time in a long time, I was at rest. I used to believe that strength meant control, that if I checked every beam, every bolt, nothing in my life could collapse. But I was wrong. I missed the fracture inside my own home. I trusted without verifying, loved without questioning, and nearly lost everything because of it. This isn't just a family revenge story, it's a warning written in scars. And like many grandpa's stories, it proves that age doesn't protect you from betrayal. Sometimes it only makes you a quieter target. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never surrender your awareness, no matter how much you love someone. Trust should be strong, but never blind. Evil doesn't always arrive with noise. It often comes dressed as family, speaking softly while dismantling your life piece by piece. I learned that the hard way. And like all family revenge story arcs, the truth didn't save me. Immediately, it tested me first. There were nights I felt completely alone. But I held on to one thing: God sees what we cannot. Even when lies surround you, truth has a way of surfacing slowly, painfully, but inevitably. That's something I will never forget. So, if you're listening to this as part of Grandpa Stories, don't just hear it, learn from it. Protect your name. Protect your mind. And never let anyone convince you that you are weaker than you truly are. This was my family revenge story, and if my voice still reaches you, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Where are you watching from today? And what would you do if you were in Alaric's position? Would you fight back or walk away? I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. And just a small note, while inspired by real human struggles and social themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests. And remember, some of the strongest grandpa stories aren't about age, they're about survival.